Hello, everyone. Tonight we start with one of the most surprising aspects of medieval thought. Those strange, complicated superstitions about sex demons and what may be developing inside of you if you weren't observant. The fire is burning low, the air is heavy with incense and whispers, and you are standing at the edge of a smoky, candle-lit room. It is the year 1254 outside. And you've just been warned that a demon might enter your chamber and give you a kid if you even entertain amorous thoughts before bed. There is no pressure. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing how far this slumbering small town extends is always entertaining. To create a gentle background hum, switch on a fan and dim the lights, and let's take it slow as we embark on our journey tonight. As the chickens move in their cages outside the window, you recline on your itchy straw mattress. You're fortunate to be married. Nevertheless, there is a lengthy list of spiritual cautions associated with your evening actions. You see, sex was more than just a physical act in the medieval worldview. Oh no. It was a spiritual bet, a cosmic danger, and a possible opening for demons to enter both literally and figuratively. Let's begin with incubi and sububi, the main characters of tonight's story. These were not only bedtime whispers of fear. Clergy experts and more than one half-melted saint relic supported them as real threats. Male demons known as incubi preyed on women as they slept. In contrast, succubi, yes, you guessed it, were female demons that wooed males asleep. It wasn't just a humiliating accident if you woke up a little sweaty after a particularly intense dream one night. Not at all. They had assaulted you, visited you, and perhaps even gotten you pregnant. And that leads us to the kids. Yes, indeed. Because it was thought that a woman who conceived under demonic influence may give birth to an unsatisfactory child. It might appear human. It might have luminous eyes, hooves, or be hairy. Whether these tales were real, symbolic, or just a cunning tactic used by the church to guilt individuals into abstinence is still up for debate among historians. The monk Caesarius of Heististerbach, who documented many stories of women giving birth to demon spawn following unapproved liaisons or unclean dreams, provided one of the most notorious examples. While some of these kids were reportedly left behind in the forest, others were raised in secret, with their parents reportedly hoping every day that their children wouldn't develop bat wings or begin speaking in tongues. To be honest, every outburst in the Middle Ages must have been accompanied by a sidelong glance and a hushed, "Do you think?" However, not all churches believe that sex portends disaster. And now for the saints, the very oddly celibate ones. Introducing Pelagia the harlot, also known as Saint Pelagia. She was highly known in the community prior to her conversion. However, she changed her ways, became a nun, and spent the remainder of her life in seclusion in a cave after seeing the light and perhaps realizing how awful medieval birth control was. In order to avoid temptation, she is said to have burned her expensive clothing and chopped off her hair, according to her mythology. This may seem extreme, but it becomes clear that vanity was a gateway sin in medieval Europe. You might as well call forth Satan yourself with a plunging neckline. Saint Benedict comes next. It is said that this impoverished man, enticed by the beauty of a woman, once plunged himself into a thorn bush to punish his flesh, a shrub with thorns. Consider telling your pals why you have so many scratches on your body. Yes, I threw myself against the barbed wire of nature after spotting a lovely ankle. Thanks, I feel better now. Additionally, it was said that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux possessed such a soothing aura that women would go into a frenzy simply by being in his presence. He therefore made an effort to never make eye contact. As you stroll along the street, look Bernard in the eye. Your hello. Bernard plunges against the closest wall of the monastery. They weren't the only saints. Chastity was promoted as a sort of divine cheat code and as a virtue in a whole culture of spiritual self-denial. You became more holy the more you resisted, which meant that unless you were obviously intending to conceive, sex, marital, scheduled, even candlelit with Gregorian chants, was never really sinless. There were regulations even back then. Those will be covered in a later section. Yes, exactly. You may be asking yourself, did people really fear sex this much? How did anyone become a parent? With prayer, they grudgingly responded. Additionally, it was frequently believed that desire was a symptom of spiritual weakness. Many medieval philosophers, like the venerable St. Augustine, held that the deed was irrevocably ruined by original sin. Humans may have had children without truly appreciating the procedure until Adam and Eve fouled things up. Then pleasure came into play, and guilt followed. People did crazy things to fight that. On Sundays, feast days during Lent, before communion, after childbirth, and just much any time the moon appeared judgmental. Couples would refrain. Couples may have had fewer than 100 acceptable nights annually, according to some records. Consider attempting to schedule intimacy around a calendar that is more extensive than the grimoire in your community. In order to live a more holy life, some married couples went even farther and decided to live as brother and sister. Some even swore chastity vows jointly, which, let's face it, may have simplified family get-togethers. However, the facts of biology could not be completely suppressed by rumors of demonic spawn and saintly abstention. Pregnancy still occurred. People were still tempted. And the imagination of the Middle Ages did what it always does. With tales, legends, and enough scandal to make even a contemporary gossip blogger blush. It filled in the gaps that were frightening, humorous, and profoundly human. Until you curl up in your blanket tonight and watch the candlelight flicker until it goes out behind your eyelids. Keep in mind that if you were alive at the time, your fantasies might have led to physical activity or parenthood. Rest well. Through a thin strip of animal hide draped across your small window, you can see the high moon. Additionally, your neighbor is loudly praying for the right lunar alignment to produce a child who won't be cursed, malformed, or worse, a heretic, not for rain or health. Greetings from the perplexing nexus of family planning and medieval astrology. In the Middle Ages, people were not only checking to see whether their hens were still alive or if the crops had sprouted. They were looking up at the sky, because time was crucial when it came to sex and conception. And no, it's not like the ovulation tracking apps of today. Instead, it's more like the moon is waning and Venus is rising in Pisces, so we won't do it tonight to avoid having a tail-born child. You sit on a scratchy straw-stead mat next to your husband. You two are gazing at the stars outside the window. It's not romantic. It is a calculated move. You're attempting to recall the local almanac's statement regarding Saturn's position. Because if you mess this up and get pregnant at the wrong time, you can wind up with a violent child born under the sign of Mars. Enjoy your new chronic liar if you were born when Mercury was retrograde. Books on astrology at the time were chock full of intricate charts and dire cautions. Phases of the moon were especially significant. A lot of people thought that having intercourse when the moon was full improved your chances of getting pregnant, but it also raised your chances of having a crazy child. It was lucky to have a waxing moon. Weakness came from a declining one, and don't even consider it during an eclipse. The child's soul could be at risk in addition to being physically marked. It wasn't a date night. Cosmic roulette was what this was. Whether the majority of medieval peasants actually adhered to these astrological sex norms or only imitated what educated clergy and doctors told them is still up for debate among historians. However, one thing is evident. People's desires changed as a result of the star's impact, which extended into the bedroom. Doctors of the day, not to be outdone, added their own twist to the chaos. Galen and Avicenna, two medical authorities whose theories were replicated for ages, claimed that the stars affected both physical characteristics and personality. Do you want a tall, intelligent kid? When Jupiter is rising, try to get pregnant. Wish to steer clear of a child that has a sad disposition. Translation is, pregnancy still occurred. People were still tempted. And the imagination of the Middle Ages did what it always does. With tales, legends, and enough scandal to make even a contemporary gossip blogger blush. It filled in the gaps that were frightening, humorous, and profoundly human. Until you curl up in your blanket tonight and watch the candlelight flicker until it goes out behind your eyelids. Keep in mind that if you were alive at the time, your fantasies might have led to physical activity or parenthood. Rest well. Through a thin strip of animal hide draped across your small window, you can see the high moon. Additionally, your neighbor is loudly praying for the right lunar alignment to produce a child who won't be cursed, malformed, or worse, a heretic, not for rain or health. Greetings from the perplexing nexus of family planning and medieval astrology. In the Middle Ages, people were not only checking to see whether their hens were still alive or if the crops had sprouted. They were looking up at the sky, because time was crucial when it came to sex and conception. And no, it's not like the ovulation tracking apps of today. Instead, it's more like the moon is waning and Venus is rising in Pisces, so we won't do it tonight to avoid having a tail-born child. You sit on a scratchy straw-stead mat next to your husband. You two are gazing at the stars outside the window. It's not romantic. It is a calculated move. You're attempting to recall the local almanac's statement regarding Saturn's position. Because if you mess this up and get pregnant at the wrong time, you can wind up with a violent child born under the sign of Mars. Enjoy your new chronic liar if you were born when Mercury was retrograde. Books on astrology at the time were chock full of intricate charts and dire cautions. Phases of the moon were especially significant. A lot of people thought that having intercourse when the moon was full improved your chances of getting pregnant, but it also raised your chances of having a crazy child. It was lucky to have a waxing moon. Weakness came from a declining one, and don't even consider it during an eclipse. The child's soul could be at risk in addition to being physically marked. It wasn't a date night. Cosmic roulette was what this was. Whether the majority of medieval peasants actually adhered to these astrological sex norms or only imitated what educated clergy and doctors told them is still up for debate among historians. However, one thing is evident. People's desires changed as a result of the star's impact, which extended into the bedroom. Doctors of the day, not to be outdone, added their own twist to the chaos. Galen and Avicenna, two medical authorities whose theories were replicated for ages, claimed that the stars affected both physical characteristics and personality. Do you want a tall, intelligent kid? When Jupiter is rising, try to get pregnant. Wish to steer clear of a child that has a sad disposition. Translation is, was grumpy. Who knew for sure? What mattered was that your whole reproductive fate was tied to the sky in your eyes. Just be thankful that you don't have to schedule your romantic life around Jupiter's mood swings tonight, when your eyelids get tired and the stars begin to dimly sparkle overhead. Or fear that your unborn child will be a juggler since you sneezed during pregnancy. Rest peacefully and may astrology support your dreams. When you wake up, something doesn't feel right. Your neighbor casually remarks that your womb might be moving while your legs are unsteady and your stomach is roiling. As in, literally. People genuinely thought that the uterus possessed a mind of its own during the Middle Ages. Greetings from the untamed realm of roving wombs and the numerous futile attempts to confine them. Consider this. One day, as a woman from the Middle Ages, you suddenly pass out. Alternatively, you may get a panic attack or simply feel extremely irritable. The explanation is straightforward. Your uterus has decided to take a brief tour of your body because it is bored. They took this illness, called hystericapaxia, very seriously. Doctors honestly think that if the uterus becomes untreated, it may rise higher and compress your heart, lungs, or even your brain. This, of course, resulted in a variety of strange symptoms. Breathing difficulties, convulsions, and unexpected outbursts of tears. Does that sound familiar? Yes, exactly. It served as the medieval justification for what we now know to be sadness, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. Whether these roaming womb beliefs apply to all women or only to those who didn't quite match the very strict mold of silent, submissive, and perpetually fertile women of the time is still up for debate among historians. In any case, it resulted in some quite insane therapies. There are numerous odors associated with the first step in treating a mobile uterus. According on the womb's current location, you could use either pleasant or unpleasant odors to entice it back into position. You may scare it downward by placing something strong, like burnt hair or a little amount of feces, next to the nose if it was rising towards the head. Simultaneously, a sweet scent, such as warm honey or rose oil, would be administered close to the pelvis, like a fragrant call to return home. Reverse the feeling as though the uterus had somehow dropped too low, which is something they did think was possible. Additionally, there were always manual techniques of uterine pain if scent-based approaches failed. Gentle pressure techniques may be tried by doctors and midwives, who are frequently significantly more knowledgeable. Naturally, when we say gentle, we intend to prod randomly until something happens. Because you're not exactly dealing with precision when your anatomy texts are merely loose translations of old Greek scrolls. Not to mention the medieval notion that extended celibacy can promote wandering. Indeed, sexlessness was once thought to be harmful to women's health. Without daily activity, a bored womb may rebel. All of the teachings we just discussed about morality and purity were directly at odds with this belief. Women were supposed to be modestly pursued, always accessible for childbirth, and not overly pursued. Alternatively, your uterus may march up your spine in protest. It is, quite frankly, tiring. It makes sense why people were fainting. Nor were men exempt from strange anatomical notions. According to some theorists, men's bodies may fill with harmful heat or vapors as a result of excessive desire. Bloodletting is the answer. Because if medieval medicine liked anything more than leeches, it was exhausting you to the point where you forgot what was wrong. Later, though, more on that. Because it gets even stranger, let's go back to the uterus. According to some texts, it had the shape of a tiny animal. One well-known author from the 12th century likened it as a ravenous creature that prowled the body in quest of food. Little creature, hungry. It's easy to see how women's bodies were ensnared in a language of mystery and terror. You are more than a symptomatic individual. You are hosting a semi-insentient organ that might destroy marriages and induce seizures. Not to mention frenzy itself. The Greek word hyster, which means uterus, is where the phrase originates. Long into the contemporary age, the term female hysteria was used to describe a wide range of behaviors, including sexual desire, intransigence, and simple agitation. In other words, someone was going to blame your reproductive organs if you weren't grinning pleasantly while churning butter and quietly giving birth to 12 children. The concept of the roaming womb was being questioned by certain intellectuals by the late Middle Ages. They observed that identical symptoms were present in men: desperation, fainting, and panic attacks. They created male frenzy and went on, even though the sensible reaction would have been, maybe this isn't about uteruses. For heaven's sake, we shouldn't change the entire theory. In reality, the wandering womb theory influenced social behavior as much as medical. A lady might be taken to a religious retreat, have a medical examination, or even be exorcised if she acted out, sobbed in public, or simply desired a sleep and some alone time. Yes. Modern experts have now regarded several cases of possessed women as straightforward cases of untreated mental illness or trauma. However, it was all attributed to that inner traveling troublemaker at the time, as well as the therapies. Oh, they were inventive. Perfumed steam baths, herbal tinctures, hot compresses, intense prayer, and in certain situations, forced marriage. Yes, exactly. If your womb was giving you trouble, a husband could be the answer. Because nothing calms enigmatic inner turmoil like being given to Bartholomew, a man who has 3 hens and takes baths twice a year. Medieval ladies found themselves in a perplexing situation as a result. Your body served as a battlefield where real survival, pseudoscience, and moral standards clashed. If you were overly fervent, there was a problem. There was a problem if you were too unconcerned. Your womb was acting strangely if you became ill. Your uterus may have gone on strike if you were unable to conceive. With your little fragrant sash tucked under your belt, you continued your day in the hopes that the lavender would keep everything in its proper place and that no one would accuse you of witchcraft for simply letting out a loud sigh at Mass. As the night air cools and your blankets settle, you can rest easily knowing that your organs are in their proper place and that nobody is trying to prove it to you with a stick of incense and goat breath. As a monk teaches on the benefits of celibacy, not merely as a personal decision, but as a superpower, you stand in the chilly nave of a stone chapel with your eyes lowered. Not having sex was not solely a religious decision throughout the Middle Ages. It was thought to grant access to magical powers, heavenly wisdom, and in severe situations, actual levitation. There are individuals all around you, my friend, who believe that virginity is the quickest route to sainthood and possibly even to flight. This may sound like fan fiction from the Middle Ages, but it was a common belief. Celibacy was viewed as a biological advancement in addition to a theological goal. It wasn't simply about impressing your local bishop by avoiding sexual temptations. It was thought to bring you closer to the divine, cleanse the body, and enlighten the mind. Your soul became lighter the less you were dependent on worldly pleasures. Enough light. Some say they hover. Whether tales of floating monks were intended to be interpreted literally or as poetic allegories for spiritual ecstasies is still up for debate among historians. However, there are a lot of fanciful stories in medieval saint histories. One well-known example is Saint Joseph of Certino, who was rumored to levitate when praying fervently. After weeks of fasting, witnesses said he would occasionally lift a few feet off the ground, sometimes mid-mon. And it's severe celibacy, you guessed it. Nor was it merely drifting. It was thought that celibate saints received a variety of supernatural benefits. The capacity to communicate with angels, speak several languages, heal the sick, and live solely on Eucharistic bread and pure energy. According to legend, Saint Catherine of Siena went years without eating, only being kept alive by the body of Christ and a fierce hatred of sin. Meanwhile, you've already skipped dinner and are feeling lightheaded. There were strong theological undertones to this fixation on chastity. According to church doctrine, lust, more especially Adam and Eve's disastrous fruit-snacking adventure in Eden, is how original sin came into the world. Therefore, you were closer to the purity of pre-fall humanity the less lust you had in your life. Virgin martyrs, such as Saint Lucy and Saint Agnes, rose to fame in the spiritual world. Their tales frequently included dramatic final moments in which they refused to get married or be raped, occasionally opting to die rather than be defiled. These stories weren't merely motivational. They were used as moral guidelines, as weapons. Celibacy was presented to males as a noble endeavor. Hermits, monks, and priests were spiritual warriors who fought temptation by fasting, isolating themselves, and sometimes killing themselves. Imagine being so pious that your idea of a Good Friday night is using a branch to beat yourself in order to divert your attention from unclean thoughts. In order to prevent arousal, monastic manuals frequently provided specific advice. These included sleeping on hard floors, taking cold showers, and learning whole psalms to recite at the first sign of impure thoughts. A monk in the 12th century told readers that if they were tempted, they should hit their chest and flee to the cloister. Ankles are obviously a gateway sin. Therefore, another suggested avoiding spicy meals, laughing excessively, or spending too much time staring at one's own ankles. Celibacy was frequently linked to control for women. Male clergy viewed virgins as more trustworthy since they were perceived as pure and more like the Virgin Mary. In actuality, a lot of women joined convents because they were the only respectable option available to them outside of marriage or poverty, not just because they were religiously inclined. In a society where women had little choices, nuns could become scribes, instructors, or even abbeys' positions of actual power. There were also the mystics. Women, such as Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen, wrote evocative theological visions that they claimed were inspired by God. After extended periods of chastity and seclusion, visions are frequently received. It was an obvious message. Desire access to the divine? Do not take off your trousers. Alternatively, you can usually use 37 buttons and a rope belt to keep your long linen shift in place. However, not everyone supported celibacy as a way of life. Dissent muttering were heard even inside the church. Because marriage was an inconvenient sacrament, some theologians were concerned that exalting celibacy too much might diminish its significance. Others drew attention to the fact that the clergy were frequently anything but celibate. Indeed, numerous monastic documents contain cautions concerning covert liaisons, unexpected offspring, and monks who inexplicably became ill whenever Sister Agnes was there. However, the myth remained. Being celibate was more than just a virtue. It was a brand. Nothing says holy like perpetual physical suffering. Thus, being chaste meant being in control, pure, powerful, and sometimes itchy from your horsehair undershirt. The pious went to great lengths. To avoid any human interaction, some hermits relocated to caves or sat atop columns. Others wore chains around their waists to bind the flesh or remain silent. One German nun even willingly locked herself in a tiny chamber with walls. That's avoiding Tinder on a whole new level. Despite all of the drama, many people simply made their best efforts in silence. They were merely ordinary people negotiating the spiritual labyrinth of medieval morality. They were neither saints nor sinners. Perhaps they fulfilled a promise for a while. Perhaps they made a mistake and admitted it. Perhaps they felt warm and perplexed after staring at a monk for too long, because this is the problem, and in medieval Europe, it made desire gloriously strange. No one declared out, denying desire doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it weird. So tonight, while you lie in bed, grateful that no one demands you to wear a thorny belt or fast for 40 days, realize that you can be at peace without levitation. All you need to sleep without sin is a comfortable pillow, a clear conscience, and the understanding that you don't need to commit all 150 psalms to memory. The stone floor beneath your feet and the sounds of hushed prayers outside chill you as you awaken before the sun comes up. You're not there for vegetables on this market day. Your goal is to purchase a miracle, not the religious type. Sort of. You've heard tales of a relic that could resolve the most elusive problem in your marital bedtime routine. Greetings from the mysterious world of holy relics and their surprising use in the medieval bedroom. Because the church dominated almost every area of life throughout the Middle Ages, including your sex life, people frequently looked to saints for a little comfort rather than spiritual enlightenment. Consider it spiritual customer service for physical issues. Indeed, if circumstances weren't, let's say, stepping up to the plate, you could pray to certain saints. Saint Valentine was among the most well-known of these. Not only is she the patroness of romantic love, but she is also, surprisingly, called upon when someone with epilepsy faints, and yes, fails to consummate a marriage. Not exactly what contemporary greeting cards promote. In the hopes that being close to the sacred would heal what no herbal remedy or midnight goat charm could, pilgrims would journey great distances to touch or see relics connected to Valentine and others. Whether people actually think these relics had magical powers, or if it was just the medieval equivalent of trying everything because your in-laws were starting to ask awkward questions, is still up for debate among historians. In any case, it became quite difficult to distinguish between the sensual and the religious. Consider the case of St. Agnes. She is said to be so spiritually powerful and virginal that worshipping at her shrine will heal infertility. Desperate couples would visit her tomb and leave tributes such as fruit, embroidered linens, or, strangely enough, wooden carvings in the shape of babies. These were proposals rather than toys. "Send us a real one, St. Agnes, please." The contact relics that were said to have touched a saint's body were more bizarre. Both hair and bones were in style. Additionally, there were belt sandals and, in one instance, a saint's toenail for the pious. Just the nail, not the entire toe. Because obviously, when it came to benefits in the bedroom, even a partial holiness was preferable to nothing. It wasn't all saintly matchmaking and hopeful couples, though. Targeted were several relics. People have reportedly touched a sacred cross or a blessed staff to particular body areas, usually in private and frequently with a great deal of embarrassment, in the hopes that the divine spark will strike like a celestial lightning bolt. Imagine it as acupuncture from the Middle Ages, but with spiritual side effects. One particularly strange story is from France in the 14th century, when a man who was paralyzed by what is now known as anxiety-induced impotence was persuaded to sleep next to a local saint's tomb. Not next to it, but next to it. He did, and history has it that he woke up feeling both physically and spiritually revitalized. He was back in business, which was the implicit message. It wasn't just men either. Women also turned to saints and relics for assistance, particularly those related to fertility. Here, Saint Margaret of Antioch was well known. Medieval imaginations saw her survival of being swallowed by a dragon as a metaphor for surviving childbirth. Pregnant ladies, of course, grasped her medallions and, like a medieval epidural, chanted her name during labor. Some midwives even had tiny relics in their pouches that they were prepared to push into their patients' hands or stomachs. Was there magic involved? Was it medication? Was it merely something to cling to when everything else seemed so scary? Most likely, all three. Let's now discuss logistics. How were these relics even obtained? Many were kept behind thick glass, in elaborate cases, or in monasteries or cathedrals. However, some took a trip. Like miracle salesmen, itinerant monks and relic vendors would go around cities, giving a donation in exchange for a fleeting glance or even a touch. The more unusual the artifact, the greater the price, of course. Wish to touch St. John, the Baptist's finger? You'll pay for that. Are you interested in borrowing a portion of St. Bernard's robe? Make connections. Forgeries were even present, many of them, enough to tenfold fill every cathedral. It's almost astonishing how some relics had adult-sized heads despite being blatantly fake-like skulls that belonged to saints who died at the age of 12. Belief was still strong. And even a dubious toenail begins to appear like hope when all other choices have been exhausted. Not everybody was in agreement. Over-reliance on relics for bodily graces, according to certain theologians, verges on superstition. Saints, according to others, should be concerned with your soul, not your libido. However, the majority disregarded such voices. Divine intervention seemed like your best option when your lover was giving you that disappointed look again, your clothing were itching, and your evenings were long. Success was never assured, of course. There were dozens of awkward silences and bashful confessions for every miracle healing. Still, people continued to arrive. They had faith, and occasionally that faith was sufficient to change things. The human tale has always included the placebo effect, as we now refer to it. Imagine a world where your deepest desires were carried on the back of a pilgrim's bag, encased in velvet and trust, when the fire goes out tonight and your blankets settle. In a world where saints and relics were more than just symbols, they were lifelines, and where someone very likely once said, "It's working," with meaning, regardless of how bizarre or nonsensical it all seems. Rest well. And perhaps the ancient saints are still listening if you have a dream about them tonight. A clay bottle containing what appears to be powdered unicorn horn has just been delivered to you, and the tavern smells like old shoes and cooked onions. Before going to bed, you're instructed to sprinkle a little under your tongue, and before you know it, you'll be energized by dawn. Welcome to the realm of medieval aphrodisiacs and potions, when desperation, love, and desire came together in some incredibly bizarre places, like the bottom of a glass. Let's begin with the traditional songs. The alternatives ranged from culinary curiosity to full-on witchy craziness, and everyone wanted to improve their amorous performance or arouse someone else's devotion. Beef testicles that have been dried and powdered into a fine powder seems to be a surefire method to get people excited. Hearts of crocodiles bathed in wine. Better still, let's not even talk about smashed emeralds. Expensive, risky, yet incredibly promising if you all had nothing to lose and a noble budget. Historians continue to debate whether the preparation and use of these items was part of a ritualized placebo effect or whether they were ever really thought to function. One thing is for sure, though. People embraced these bizarre mixtures, frequently incorporating a startling number of animal parts and loved terror into their everyday activities. Imagine yourself as a young, anxious groom with your wedding night approaching. When you go to the local pharmacy, they will give you a mixture of dried mandre and ginger cinnamon, possibly with a little honey wine for bravery. Sound gentle. The courteous version is that. There are other parts of Europe where you can acquire powdered antler, goat bile, or bat blood tonic. Since thinking bats are virile and nocturnal, it stands to reason that consuming their essence will improve your performance after dark. Additionally, the recipe book completely changed if you were attempting to suppress desire. In an effort to cool their bodies, monks and nuns occasionally ate bitter herbs like rue or lettuce. According to medieval humor philosophy, being cold and dry meant having less passion. In severe situations, they would even wear iron or lead charms to stave off temptation. In essence, brighter versions of emotional chastity belts. Aphrodisiacs, however, were not limited to cloistered monks or anxious lovers. These potions were also used by married couples, particularly when things had become a bit stale. A lady might use a midwife's secret ingredients to give her husband a little spice. Before going to bed, a husband may apply an odd ointment to his wrist. The confidence was strangely specific, yet the ingredients were nearly always ambiguous. She'll treat you like it's spring if you take this. An Italian herbal treatise from the 14th century contained one of the most bizarre prescriptions for inciting love. Before attempting to court someone, roasted worms were steeped in red wine for 3 days, strained and then sipped. Was it successful? Hard to say. However, if someone kissed you despite your breath smelling like worm wine, it meant they were either drinking it or were deeply in love. Not to be overlooked are the symbolic meals. It was thought that some objects inherently stimulated the senses. Sensuality was linked to figs, honey, almonds, and even eels. Spices like cloves and saffron were considered luxury goods and were frequently associated with decadence. Thus, it was more than just taste when they were added to food. Hinting was the key. Debatable, subtle, possibly effective. But keep in mind that even a slightly delicious fig could feel like a kiss on the soul if all you had to eat was rough bread and cabbage. Next came dried mixtures known as love powders, which you could conceal in a pouch and slip into someone's beverage. Frequently combining pulverized herbs with hair clippings, nail trims, and occasionally, body fluids. They were almost magical. People believed in the magic of love powders, despite their dubious ethics. Additionally, depending on where you live, you could be found excommunicated or charged with witchcraft if you are caught using one. Speaking of magic, apothecaries did not produce all love potions. Tonics made by folk healers, who were mostly women, straddled the boundary between superstition and medicine. They were occasionally trusted more than physicians in rural areas. However, when a marriage failed or a guy became inexplicably weak, they were the first to be held responsible in urban areas or during times of witch panic. On occasion, even religious leaders dabbled in the aphrodisiac industry. Some monasteries offered Saint Blessed holy beverages that were supposed to boost fertility or spark elderly couples' passion again. What was in them was not acknowledged. Rumors, however, ranged from fennel soaked in vinegar to deer antler dust. Enough ambiguity to be both lustful and sacred. Yes, let's return to the topic of unicorns. Their horns, which were actually narwhal tusks disguised as magical artifacts, were pulverized into a dazzling white powder and marketed as a remedy for marital sickness and toxic infertility. Naturally, you couldn't buy it, but wealthy aristocrats purchased them from the Graham, who said it restored the spark. To be honest, the price tag may have done the majority of the work. There was some truth to some of these old recipes, even with their strange components and dubious preparation techniques. For example, ginger actually improves blood flow. Undoubtedly, wine reduces inhibitions. Honey gives you more energy. Accordingly, there were likely some very real physical, emotional, and psychological repercussions, even though bat wings and beaver parts might not withstand scientific investigation. Not to mention the social component. Perhaps more intimate than the drink itself was the sharing of an enigmatic tonic, the whispering of its powers, and the laughter over its harshness. Sometimes the best aphrodisiac is the belief of attention. Be happy that you didn't have to barter for powdered antler at a flea market or roast worms for love tonight when you curl up under your blankets. In the cause of love, may no one ever offer you a cup of beetle wine. May your ingredients be edible, and may your dreams be sweet. Something rubs against your chest when you're nestled into a straw mattress, half sleeping. You can't move, yet you try. You want to scream, but your mouth doesn't open. Overhead, a thick darkness murmurs incomprehensible words. Is this a dream? Or would you think it was something much worse if you were in the Middle Ages? A demon lover's visit. Introducing the original source of medieval bedroom panic, the incubus and succubus. A male monster known as the incubus is said to have sneaked into women's beds and impregnated them against their will. His sexy female counterpart, the succubus, preyed on men, extracting their essence while they slept. It was more than myth. It was accepted as a valid reason for erotic dreams, sleep paralysis, and even unexplained pregnancies. Indeed, it meant that people weren't whispering unpleasant dreams if you woke up in a vulnerable situation. A demonic assault was being whispered by them. Sex and the paranormal were entangled in a web of superstition, shame, and fear throughout medieval Europe. Biology was not as well understood as it is today. They had no idea what was causing hallucinations, nightmares, or night emissions. Therefore, it was common to attribute incomprehensible events, particularly those that were humiliating or taboo, to external powers, ideally ones with horns and a negative attitude. Historians continue to debate whether these beliefs represented true fear among the general public, or were mostly employed by clergy to intimidate individuals into abstinence. However, confessions, sermons, and even trial testimony detailing these demonic encounters in explicit, frightful detail abound in historical documents. The Malus Maliparum, an infamous manuscript from the 15th century, even described how succubi would gather sperm from their victims, transfer it to incubi, and then utilize it to produce demon-human hybrids. Yes, exactly. Demons were said to possess a long-distance chain similar to a terrifying UPS for body fluids. These were also not outlandish concepts. Since demons didn't technically have bodies, even reputable theologians disagreed over how they handled reproduction. Some claimed that incubi used dead bodies to transform into humans. Others thought that devils may briefly inhabit a person in order to accomplish their goals by borrowing their flesh. Furthermore, some things never change, even if this sounds uncomfortably similar to an ex attributing their terrible behavior to possession. You try not to think about it as you roll over in your medieval bed. There's more, though. Some thought that these demons weren't only chance guests. Favorites were among them. Night after night, men reported seeing the same succubus, and they frequently described her in great detail. Glistening eyes, long black hair, and a thunderous voice. Women also reported that if they attempted to resist, their incubi grew envious or vindictive. The demon father notion also comes into play if a child was born under dubious circumstances or out of wedlock. Some babies were said to have strange powers, to be overly hairy, or to look too strong. In one instance, a mother claimed that her infant was born speaking Latin. Despite not believing her, the church forced her to perform public penance as a precaution. Additionally, there were the well-known saints' dream temptations. For example, it was claimed that while Saint Anthony lived in the desert, he was tormented by sexy images. He was frequently portrayed by artists, with half-naked demons attempting to seduce him. It was implied that nocturnal visitors may harm even the most pious of men. What steps could you take to safeguard yourself then? People used a variety of cures, such as sleeping with one eye open and remaining celibate. Charms, which were worn around the neck or under pillows, were common little amulets made of blessed wood or iron bone. Some people held crucifixes in their hands while they slept. Others purified the bedroom by burning herbs like demon bane, a dramatic name for a very common plant, or fennel sage. The more drastic methods included fasting while sleeping in church or getting exorcisms, not because you were possessed, but because your dreams were possessed. A document from the 14th century even suggests mumbling certain Bible passages before bed, not for protection, but to make one less desirable to demons. The distinction between nightmare and reality was hazy. Picture yourself snuggling yourself in and murmuring, "Let not thy servant tempt the night with fruitless longing," the medieval equivalent of saying, "Not tonight, Satan." Night terrors, epilepsy, and even sleep paralysis were frequently viewed as spiritual ailments. Additionally, dreams involving any kind of desire were viewed as moral faults or, worse, invitations to evil because sexuality was so strongly associated with sin and guilt. Nevertheless, there was intrigue despite the danger. There was a spooky charm to the notion of lovely, enticing spirits scuttling through the night. Stories of incubi and succubi spread widely, inspiring whispered rumors and song plays. Despite their terrible nature, they also provided a peculiar form of solace to individuals. Perhaps it wasn't your fault after all, if a mistake might be attributed to a demon. Just as you are wondering if that shadow in the corner was a trick of the moonlight or something more, remember all those people who were lying ages ago tonight as your eyes close and your limbs go weary. It's most likely just the wind if you sense a breeze. You are most likely at the blacksmith's shop for something far more intimate than horseshoes or a new cooking pot. The blacksmith points to a little wooden chest, and when he unlocks it with a menacingly jingling key, it's there. A metal belt with narrow openings, locking mechanisms, and a design that shouts discomfort and poor choices. Well done. The chastity belt has just been introduced to you. Yes, exactly. One of the most persistent and misinterpreted relics of medieval mythology is the chastity belt. You may have heard the jokes and seen the cartoons, but it wasn't just a historical meme or a silly idea. Deep-seated fears of control, inheritance, and faithfulness were the foundation of the notion that a person's body should be imprisoned in order to preserve virtue, or more frequently, property. Let's go back. In fact, there is disagreement about the idea that chastity bands were a common medieval practice. Whether they were more of a Renaissance innovation or widely employed in the Middle Ages is still up for debate among historians. Attributed to past generations in retrospect, some people think that rather than being authentic examples of medieval humility, the majority of surviving examples date from the 16th century or even later Victorian imagination. However, it should be noted that the concept of the chastity belt was prevalent during the Middle Ages, and whether it was ceremonial, symbolic, or genuine, it mirrored a disturbing reality. Women's sexuality was viewed as something to be controlled, protected, and, if need, sequestered rather than as their own. Assume the role of a nobleman who is set to embark on the Crusades. Your young bride is untrustworthy. More precisely, you don't trust the scores of attractive squires who will remain in your midst while you're away battling unbelievers. The answer is to commission a unique metal gadget that will protect her. Bonus points if the key remains at your neck, resembling a sentimental yet extremely troublesome necklace. For maximum agony and little hygienic value, these belts were frequently composed of iron with narrow slits. Some had leather padding, some were spiked. Spikes. As if it weren't already unpleasant to refrain. Imagine sitting with an actual cage between your thighs, let alone walking. It wasn't nuanced, it wasn't waterproof, and it wasn't breathable either. Here's the twist, though. The majority of women who wore these probably didn't wear them all the time. Chastity belts, according to many historians, were more symbolic than practical ceremonial items or wedding presents intended to suggest rather than force fidelity. Some may have been used temporarily, such as during religious fasting or times of separation disease. Others might have been stored as menacing discussion starters and never worn. Medieval literature and art still include enough allusions to imply that the idea was both well-known and feared. Moral stories about lust-driven, abandoned women who are either saved or punished by the abrupt click of a lock. In other tales, if a lady strays, the belt magically tightens. In others, the chastity key is blessed by an angel who descends. In any case, the message is obvious. Virtue needs to be managed, ideally by another person. Did men have male chastity belts, you ask? Yes, in theory, but they were uncommon and typically presented as punishment rather than protection. The disparity says a lot. Women were viewed as both the guardians and the weakest link in medieval morality. They were supposed to be chaste and submissive, but ironically, they were also blamed for luring people. External hardware was, of course, the answer. Chastity belts were much more disturbing because they weren't limited to adult relationships. According to reports, some versions were utilized to shield young girls from violence, particularly during civil unrest or times of war. Additionally, the fact that these belts were available in juvenile sizes suggests a much darker side to the narrative, despite the paucity of data. Later on in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, one of the more strange events occurred. Chastity belts were first best suggested by medical experts as a treatment for masturbating. Yes, wearing metal trousers will help reduce itching. Teenagers may be strapped with these by their parents, who will retain the key. In order to warn others if the wearer attempted to tamper with them, some belts were even made with miniature bells. There's nothing like using puberty as a safety measure. These gadgets were produced in a specialized field, frequently by precision-trained metalworkers and locksmiths. Consider having to defend your most recent commission. Not a gate latch, please. Something a little softer. Some belts had biblical quotations, moral proverbs, or even saints' names etched on them. Others, as if to avoid drawing attention to an already taboo subject, were frighteningly unadorned. Chastity belts had gained a life of their own in the public consciousness by the 19th century. They were featured in books, museums, and curiosity stores. Some were fakes, made to make people laugh or startle. Others were real artifacts, undamaged but rusty, silent witnesses to a long history of curiosity and terror. They were shown with a mixture of terror and delight by the Victorians, who were always up for a good metaphor about repression. Furthermore, the idea of chastity belts persists even if the majority of people nowadays consider them to be fetish items or medieval myths. There are contemporary counterparts, fortunately constructed of softer materials and utilized with permission. However, the fundamental notion that sexuality needs to be controlled, suppressed, or contracted out hasn't completely disappeared. Take a moment tonight to be thankful that you have your own autonomy. while you rest comfortably without the sight of iron hinges or padlocks. That you can be trusted without a key, and that you may politely, firmly, and ideally, while backing out of the room, say no to anyone who tries to give you a set of spiked pants as a wedding present. You are on the outskirts of a busy bathhouse from the Middle Ages. Steam escaping through the wooden walls' fissures. The breeze carried the subtle aroma of ambition and sweat from rosemary. It's vibrant inside. Baths were more than just places to wash during the Middle Ages. They served as gathering places for conversation, leisure, bargaining, and, depending on the time and place, a little more risque activities. Welcome to the world of medieval public baths, where modesty frequently took a vacation and hygiene met curiosity. Before you get too comfy, it's important to remember that hygiene was, to put it mildly, complex throughout the Middle Ages. Many Europeans genuinely enjoy taking baths, especially in metropolitan areas, despite the stereotype that individuals never do so. The cities of France, Germany, and Italy were littered with bath houses called ballia in Latin. There were dozens in some towns. In addition to having individual rooms, wood-fired heaters, and hot and cold pools, they also had attendants who would do more specialized services like cleaning your nails and back trim. Whether bathhouses were primarily about hedonism, health, or hygiene is still up for debate among historians. However, the answer appeared to be all of the above by the 14th century. This means that you are only wearing a linen shift, or if you're wealthy or bold, nothing at all. There may or may not be a distinct area for men and women. Co-ed bathing was rather common in some places, particularly Germany. Whole families would accompany them. Merchants would get into a lot of trouble when they struck transactions. Couples made out, and things occasionally got out of hand behind the scenes. In a metaphorical sense, that's where things got sticky. Church leaders weren't very happy with bathhouse. In certain instances, they released full-on bans along with warning speeches. It wasn't washing itself that was the issue. Godliness came after cleanliness. Ultimately, it was the ambiance, the nudity, the mixing, and the reality that a public health facility was also functioning as a dubious-bound dating service. Nevertheless, bathhouse prospered. Some were opulent, featuring painted ceilings, mosaic floors, and attendants providing refreshments, music, and fragrant oils. Wine-spiced cakes were available, and if the rumors were accurate, friendship was not on the menu. City authorities used a variety of strategies to stop the extracurricular activities. Penalties, curfews, and unexpected inspections. For example, during Lent, baths were occasionally closed in London. In Paris, they had to keep their windows open all the time so that officials could watch how people behaved. With your foot soaked, there's nothing better than a spiritual side-eye. A lot of bathhouse even leaned on their reputations. Some adopted cheeky monikers, such as the Hot Place, the Lily House, or the Stew. Furthermore, those that also functioned as brothels weren't particularly covert. Employees may learn songs and dances, paint their nails a rare luxury, or wear ornate jewelry to amuse guests as they leave. Not every bath was a pleasure den, of course. Many have a sincere interest in health. According to medieval doctors, taking a bath helped to balance the humors, open the pores, and flush out poisons. Complete medical instructions on technique, temperature, and bath timing were available. Patients who are ill may be prescribed a weekly chamomile and thyme bath. Intricate ceremonies that combined medical and theater occasionally took wealthy invalids to mineral springs to drink the waters. Bathhouses provided a brief respite for the poorer classes, a place to escape the claustrophobic, smoke-filled dwellings of everyday life, wash away the dirt of the fields, and relax aching muscles. Up to a certain time, it was a social equalizer. Nobility had their own bathrooms. The restrooms were cloistered for monks. However, until the plagues struck, baths were widely available to the public and were popular in most places. Indeed. On the left, Enter the dark death stage. Suspicion of bathing increased in the middle of the 4th century as the bubonic plague ravaged Europe. According to some medical professionals, taking a hot bath exposes the body to harmful air and increases susceptibility. Others cautioned that sickness may spread through shared water. Suddenly, the bathhouse began to close. There were no stews in cities that used to have dozens of them. The public's perception changed. Godliness has supplanted cleanliness. It was risky. Therefore, bathing became less popular over time, albeit reluctantly and gradually. Dry cleaning techniques, rubbing with rags, changing linen shirts often, which absorbed perspiration and odor, and dousing oneself in scents became more commonplace. The foundation for covering up rather than washing off was established here, even before powdered wigs became popular. Never did the bathhouse entirely heal. Many had been destroyed, repurposed, or sanitized into obscurity by the 16th century. Legend and mockery replaced their sultry golden age. However, there were remnants of them in literature, in whispered jokes, in the old tunes your grandfather wouldn't sing in a formal setting, and in the notion that a bath could be more than a utilitarian activity. It might be scandalous, sociable, or sensual. Remember those resonant stone halls, those warm wooden tubs, and the laughing rising with the steam as you curl up in your blankets tonight? Perhaps a bit cleaner than your medieval counterpart. You left with a tale, even though you may have gone in for a scrub. The candles are flickering in the late evening. A little booklet, handwritten, slightly smudged and bound in worn leather, has been entrusted to you. You are instructed not to show it to anybody. It's neither a heretic's diary nor a spell book. It's a medieval sex manual, something far more shocking. They did exist. People in the Middle Ages weren't completely afraid to talk about the mechanics of intimacy, despite popular belief. They simply buried it beneath layers of highly dubious anatomy drawings and metaphorical caution. These manuscripts were uncommon and were disguised in medical or religious terminology, but they were unquestionably authentic. You may be among the fortunate or inquisitive few who read one when you sit by candlelight with your chamber's shimmering shadows dancing on the walls. The Secret of Secrets, or Secretum Secretorum, was the most well-known of these writings. It contained parts on reproductive body fluids and when closeness is appropriate, but it wasn't only about sex. Aristotle is said to have written it for Alexander the Great. It was a medieval bestseller, but that's completely untrue. Do you want to have a bright child? Steer clear of sexual activity during thunderstorms. Do you want a male rather than a girl? Eat leeks first. It's fairly easy stuff. Although historians continue to debate whether the general public read these guides or if they were kept secret among academics and medical professionals, some of their contents undoubtedly became part of popular culture. In certain areas, it was customary to refrain from intimacy during a full moon, not because of werewolves, but rather because too much light makes a youngster feel proud. Yes, exactly. Celestial mood lighting may destroy your baby's personality. Other books, such as the Tarula, contained relatively straightforward instructions and were centered on the health of women, how to arouse desire, rekindle a cold partner, and even fabricate pleasure to maintain a stable marriage. Yes, women in the Middle Ages experienced performance anxiety as well. Given that it might have been created by a woman, or at least assembled from female voices, the Trotula was incredibly avant-garde and realistic. Rare yet remarkable were the illustrations, and clumsily sketched couple may be positioned in a way that resembles interpretive dance rather than romance. The body was frequently depicted in cross-section in anatomical illustrations, complete with tiny arrows and sincere yet incredibly perplexed remarks. According to a well-known medieval diagram, the uterus has 7 distinct chambers, each of which is in charge of producing a particular kind of kid. Congratulations! You would have a poet if the embryo had fallen in chamber 4, a warrior in chamber 1, chamber 6. Good luck the next time. The guides frequently walked a tightrope between being scary and being helpful. They cautioned about the perils of passion, pointing out that too much delight during sexual activity could cause the liver to burn. In order to prevent their gazes from igniting wicked pride, they urged newlyweds to avoid making eye contact during the act. Additionally, they strictly forbade intercourse on Fridays, Sundays, feast days, and before or after confession. Really, you would only have maybe 3 feasible Tuesdays per year if you complied with every regulation. However, some sections glistened with true affection in spite of all the cautions. For example, a 13th century Andalusian text advised lovers to prepare the bed with aromatic oils and herbs, speak nicely to one another, and smell each other lovingly. In essence, the advice is startlingly contemporary. Don't be strange, be kind, and set the tone. Still holds up, to be honest. The Romance of the Rose was one of the more explicit pieces. In addition to its flowery metaphors, a lengthy allegorical poem gained notoriety for its vivid progression from naive flirting to, well, anything but innocent endings. It presented seduction as a courtly game that involved strategic looks, whispered compliments, and the occasional poetry scrawled on a silk sleeve. Was it considered high art? Was it covertly distributed like forbidden sweets among monasteries and extensively copied? Of course. Through commercial channels and academic translations, the Kama Sutra, a remarkably clear guide from medieval India, made its way westward. It added to the broader medieval notion that sex was a topic worth studying, even if it had to be covered in 17 layers of allegory to avoid clerical side-eye. However, it was not always accessible to the typical peasant. Not everyone agreed, of course. Such books, particularly those that were overly accurate or detailed, were denounced by church authorities. Having one can be interpreted as proof of moral decay. Publicly reading one out loud was a surefire way to get into trouble or worse. However, because people were intrigued, the books continued to exist, concealed in apothecary drawers and copied into the margins of medical publications that were discussed in private. They were perplexed. Individuals were individuals, and for people who couldn't read, even a poorly drawn graphic may be a revelation in a society where sex was strictly controlled, silently feared, and rarely explained. And the majority of the information was spread by word of mouth. The village sex instructors were frequently traveling peddlers, midwives, and herbalists. They gave advice that was both frighteningly incorrect and endearingly helpful, such as always warming the sheets before bed. To prevent getting pregnant, tie a ribbon around your ankle. However, every bit of information filled the gap left by books. Therefore, keep this in mind tonight as you close your eyes and the imagined aroma of lavender and ancient parchment wanes. People were asking the same old questions behind every scholarly scroll and opulent cathedral. Am I doing this correctly? Is this typical? In the morning, will they still like me? Sometimes the answer was a whispered advice, a clumsy depiction of a uterus with 7 mystery chambers, or a softly borrowed handbook. As a priest concludes his speech, you find yourself standing in a silent chapel with candlelight flashing on the walls. At least not directly. He is avoiding discussing sin or salvation. In particular, he is discussing when and how you are permitted to utilize your marital bed. Because the church wasn't only concerned with your Sunday mornings in the Middle Ages. It also provided a pretty detailed timetable for your evening activities. Welcome to the calendar of intimacy in the church. It's less romantic than a pail of water, more rigorous than your school schedule, and more intricate than Lent. You see, your bedroom behavior was a major part of medieval church dogma. Having sex was not a private matter. There were rules, exceptions, loopholes, and a lot of Latin at this spiritual gathering. Clergy preached that procreation inside marriage was the sole permissible reason for sexual activity. At worst, pleasure was a sin. At best, it was an unfortunate side consequence. Whether these lessons were generally aspirational or universally applied is still up for debate among historians. It is evident from sermons and confessional guides that regulations were taught and reiterated. However, depending on the couple, the area, and the thickness of the bedroom walls, what actually occurred in families most likely varied greatly. Let's discuss numbers. The church officially outlawed sex more than 100 days a year. This included the eve of communion, days of fasting, the full menstrual cycle, all important liturgical seasons, Lent, Advent, and others, as well as every Sunday, Lord's Day, and of course, every Friday, in remembrance of the crucifixion. Indeed, when you total everything up, you're looking at about 1/3 of the calendar blocked off. And that's before you take into consideration extra penance days, unique local feasts, or sporadic superstitions that added extra limitations for safety. Even as a married couple, you were technically committing a sin if you disobeyed the regulations. Confessional penance, or in severe situations, public humiliation may be necessary. And no, the feast of Saint Apollonia was not a good reason to feel particularly affectionate. As a result, you navigated your marriage like a liturgical ninja, avoiding feast days and saints like moral landmines. If your wedding night fell on a religious holiday, it could even be delayed. A priest telling you to wait until after Ascension Day is the epitome of romance. Humans are humans, of course, and medieval people weren't always compliant. Many awkwardly detailed inquiries concerning what couples may have done, when, how, and with what attitude can be found in confession manuals. The church was preoccupied with how, not just when, you did it. Thoughts, motivations, and positions were all closely examined. The missionary role was favored because it was the least wicked, not because it was effective. Otherwise, you run the risk of being called unnatural, even if both partners were on board and found it enjoyable, and God forbid, you were enthusiastic. Some theologians believe that excessive enthusiasm was a symptom of carnality, even in marriage. A wife was expected to submit with humility, and a husband was expected to lead with moderation, not a single sigh, wink, or giggle. In essence, the church intended your marital intimacy to be like a serious board meeting with your eyes closed and candlelight. It is important to note that some clergy resisted if this sounds oppressive. Some courageous theologians maintained that married love might be both joyful and sacred. One even said that a spouse's love was a preview of God's unity. However, such sounds were more subdued and frequently overpowered by preachers brandishing their fingers at interested brides and almond-eyed altar boys. In the meantime, common people managed to find their way through the labyrinth. Some couples just didn't follow the guidelines. Others sought advice from lenient confessors. Some people used their imaginations to interpret the calendar. In actuality, we didn't begin until after the bells, and St. Cert's feast officially concludes at sunset. Imagine attempting to defend a Thursday night snuggle in a society where a bishop might be looking on from the rafters if you believe that people nowadays violate the law to avoid feeling guilty. Of course, not all marriages started off as loving unions. A lot of them were chilly or transactional. These church-mandated vacations were a relief to some spouses. Others thought the limitations were harsh and perplexing, particularly those who were desperately trying to conceive. Is it not good to realize that it is St. Etheldrea's day of continuous abstinence when you finally find time for intimacy? Why are there so many rules? It has to do with control, in part. From meals to marriages, the church sought to influence every element of life. Additionally, it was partially about fear of desire and inexplicable bodily disarray. The calendar turned into an anxious and incense-drawn map of moral limits. However, people continued to fall in love and had infants who broke the laws in spite of the harsh sermons. They looked for weaknesses, muttered justifications, asked for pardon, or did not. Because desire has always set its own schedule, regardless of how many red X's are on the calendar. Imagine a world where intimacy was revered, planned, and regulated with almost fanatical precision as your limbs go heavy and the silence grows deeper tonight. Where fasting plans and bell saints controlled your bedroom life. and where you might light a candle, say a silent prayer, and hope Saint Apollonia wasn't listening too intently if everything else failed. You're walking through a bustling medieval market, past bakers, butchers, and candle sellers, when a man in a crimson hood shouts from behind a stall, "Worry not, good sir. Cure your cursed urges or ignite desire where none was before." His cart is a chaotic shrine to questionable remedies, bottles of syrupy elixirs, pouches of odd-smelling powders, and something suspiciously labeled essence of dragonfire. You're about to step into the strange and sometimes stomach-turning world of medieval medicine and its approach to well intimacy. Let's get one thing straight. Medieval doctors meant well. They worked from what they had, mostly ancient Greek theories filtered through a few centuries of guesswork and hopeful incantation. The dominant medical model was the humoral theory, which said that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, flu, bile, and black bile. Every condition, including bedroom dysfunction, was blamed on these humors being out of balance. Too much cold and wet. You were sluggish and passionless. Too much heat and dryness. Congratulations. You were a danger to yourself and others. It wasn't about what you wanted. It was about your bile behaving badly. Historians still argue whether humoral diagnoses were more symbolic than scientific, but there's no denying they guided treatments. If you lacked desire, a doctor might prescribe warming foods, ginger, cinnamon, or red wine. If you had too much desire, yes, that was considered a problem. You might be sent to a monastery or told to chew lettuce and sleep on a cold stone floor. It was all very subtle, but the truly bizarre treatments came from apothecaries and folk healers who offered tonics with ingredients that would terrify any modern pharmacist. Dried wolf liver, fox testicles, roasted ants, and the ever-popular stone of the goat's stomach, which was apparently useful for everything. One 13th century Italian manual recommended applying ground emerald paste to the forehead to suppress lust because nothing says abstinence like a sparkling green headache. And if the issue was infertility, well, brace yourself. Treatments got creative. For men, it might involve a daily tonic of boiled eggs mixed with crushed leeks and a whisper of badger fat. For women, remedies often required wearing amulets, drinking herbal brews, or sitting on warm bricks after a complicated ritual involving basil and candle wax. One German text advised women to sleep with a carved wooden fuss under the bed, not for use, but for symbolic alignment of the womb. Medieval medicine loved a good metaphor. Then there were the uromancers. Yes, people who diagnosed health conditions by examining urine. A trained uromancer could supposedly tell if a woman was pregnant, if a man was overheated with desire, or if someone had been engaging in excessive delights, all from a flask of warm pee. And they charged accordingly. Want more? Enter the leeches. If you suffered from too much burning desire, a physician might recommend bloodletting. A leech on the thigh or behind the ear was believed to calm the passions. There were even cases of applying leeches near very sensitive regions. Desperate times, as they say. Of course, not all treatments were invasive. Some healers leaned heavily on aromatherapy. Scents like myrrh, rose, and musk were used to either ignite or suppress interest. You might be given a sachet to wear beneath your clothes, carefully blended by an apothecary with the air of a perfume artist/matchmaker. A well-scented tunic could be the difference between a good evening and a week of awkward silence. And yes, some treatments were more psychological. Physicians might advise a man to avoid looking at attractive people, to occupy himself with long walks and non-erotic conversation. For women, advice often included prayer, fasting, and sleeping fully clothed, preferably in wool. There's a medieval letter from a French bishop recommending that an overly flirtatious nun be reassigned to laundry duty, where the steam may cool her fire. An image both absurd and strangely poetic. One of the oddest treatments involved astrology. Medieval doctors would sometimes consult the stars before offering advice. If Venus was in the wrong house, your passions were doomed. If Mars was dominant, you were probably too aggressive in courtship. Some couples were even advised to delay intimacy until the moon entered a more fertile phase. Mercury retrograde. Maybe just stick to cuddling. But not all medicine was ridiculous. Some practices bordered on real science. Observations about diet stress and rest influencing libido were surprisingly accurate. And herbs like ginseng and damana and ashwagandha, still sold today as natural aphrodisiacs, were already in use. Sometimes the treatment worked, sometimes it made things worse, and sometimes it was the attention itself, the ritual, the effort that reminded people they were human, fragile, and worthy of care. Still, the line between healer and charlatan was thin. For every wise midwife or thoughtful herbalist, there was someone pushing powdered frog legs and promising miracles. And in a time when people feared sin disease and damnation in equal measure, the appeal of a quick fix was hard to resist. So tonight, as your head sinks into your pillow and your humors settle into a balanced, non-frothing state, remember the strange blend of wisdom and weirdness that shaped medieval medicine. Be glad your remedies come in tidy pills and not boiled badger intestines. And if anyone ever offers you emerald paste for your romantic issues, maybe just smile, nod, and back away slowly. You're sitting on a three-legged stool in a cold, damp room, nervously watching as a robed man opens a thick ledger. Across from you, your spouse avoids your gaze. Between you stands a priest, a scribe, and possibly a town official. No, this isn't the start of a courtroom drama. It's a church-sanctioned bedroom interrogation, and it's about to get awkward. Welcome to the ecclesiastical inquest into your marital intimacy. Because in the Middle Ages, if your marriage wasn't going well, especially if it hadn't been consummated, you didn't just talk to your friends or write passive-aggressive poetry. You might have had to go to court. Church court, where people asked personal questions, very personal. This wasn't as rare as you might think. Marriages were not only spiritual contracts, but legal ones, and one of the requirements for a valid marriage was consummation. If a couple failed to do the deed or claimed they couldn't, well, that was serious business. Serious enough for investigations, testimony, and sometimes demonstrations. Historians still argue whether consummation cases were more about justice or spectacle. But the records we have show that such trials were surprisingly detailed, almost invasive, and occasionally okay, frequently ridiculous. Let's say you're a noble woman whose marriage has remained mysteriously cold. Maybe your husband is shy, maybe he's uninterested, maybe you've both been avoiding the issue by pretending that fasting days last all week. But now, your family is pressuring you. They want heirs, they want alliances, they want results. So you filed a complaint non-consummation. The court takes it seriously. Soon both parties are summoned. Witnesses are called maids, midwives, servants, anyone who might know something. The testimony often includes whether the marriage bed was disturbed, whether any sounds were heard, or if sheets were found stained. Sometimes priests performed a ritual blessing on the bed before encouraging the couple to give it another go with divine support. No pressure, right? And if there was suspicion of impotence, oh boy. The accused might be examined by a panel of experts, usually elderly matrons or physicians, tasked with determining whether the husband was physically capable. In one bizarre case, a man was ordered to perform before witnesses to prove his virility. No, not in front of a crowd, thankfully, but in a separate room under very awkward supervision with results to be reported to the court. If this sounds horrifying, imagine being the poor scribe who had to write it all down in formal Latin. On the flip side, a wife could also be examined to see whether her body showed signs of ever having received a husband. These exams were deeply invasive, incredibly flawed, and frankly traumatic by modern standards. But in the eyes of the church, they were a necessary step toward validating or annulling a marriage. If one spouse confessed to refusing intimacy without cause, that too could lead to annulment. And the definitions of cause were strict. Illness, disfigurement, or extreme cruelty might qualify, but simply not feeling it. Not a chance. Sometimes couples accused each other. One would say, "She turns away when I approach." The other might retort, "He snores through the night and eats too many onions." Courts had to sift through these claims, searching for some combination of spiritual violation and physical evidence. Cases could drag on for months, and the longer they went unresolved, the more reputations crumbled under public scrutiny. But here's the strange part. These cases weren't always about dysfunction. Sometimes they were used as exit strategies. Imagine being stuck in a loveless or arranged marriage. If you could convince the court that the union had never been consummated, you might be granted freedom. No scandalous adultery required. Just a quiet, disappointed statement under oath. Some couples conspired to use this loophole. Others fought tooth and nail to prove the opposite. One medieval couple reportedly broke into their own church file to adjust the testimony. Desperate times, etc. The church wasn't totally heartless. In cases where intimacy was deemed impossible due to injury or trauma, a separation could be granted with dignity. In a few rare and progressive instances, couples were even allowed to remain married while living separately, an early version of emotional divorce. But more often, the focus was on the act itself. Had it happened? Could it happen? Would it happen under the right circumstances? The implications of these inquiries were vast. Children born into unconsummated marriages might be deemed illegitimate. Dowries could be lost. Lands and titles reverted. For nobles, it was political dynamite. For commoners, it could mean social ruin. For women, especially the stigma of barrenness or coldness could stick for life regardless of the facts. And yes, some of these inquiries ended with the couple being told gently or not so gently to go home and try harder. The priest might offer a blessing, a sermon about love and duty, and a quiet warning. The Lord watches all beds, even in the dark. Not exactly a turn-on. Still, through all this, one truth emerges. Medieval people took sex seriously, not just as desire, but as duty. It was bound up in law, faith, and family legacy. And when things didn't go as expected, the consequences weren't just private. They were judged by candlelight, written in ink, and whispered about for generations. So tonight, as your room grows still and no one's taking notes on your love life, take a moment to be grateful that your relationships aren't subject to ecclesiastical inquiry, that your bedroom is in a courtroom, and that no one is asking your neighbors to testify about your honeymoon. You wake up on a hay-stuffed mattress in a wooden cottage, lit by morning mist, and hear the familiar rustle of a neighbor walking past with a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. She's humming as if nothing in the world is strange. But if you ask her about what's proper in the bedroom, or more precisely, what's not, she'll tell you with full confidence that some acts will make your hands shrivel, your crops fail, or your goat gives sour milk. Welcome to the quirky, tangled world of medieval sexual tabos. Let's be honest, no society is completely free of weird beliefs around intimacy. But the Middle Ages had a particular flair for mixing superstition, shame, and occasional bursts of surprisingly progressive thinking. In your sleepy village, knowledge isn't delivered in science books. It's passed on through grandmothers' parish sermons and traveling merchants who swear they once met a woman whose baby was born with goat eyes. Naturally, everyone believes them. First, let's talk about positions. Yes, even that was regulated. The church explicitly taught that only one position was acceptable, the missionary one, face-to-face man on top. Why? Because it was seen as the natural order mirroring male dominance and the supposed hierarchy of creation. Everything else sideways, seated, standing, anything involving furniture or enthusiasm was discouraged or outright condemned. One clerical guide called these acts bestial mimicry, which if nothing else sounds like a great name for a medieval metal band. Historians still argue whether these prohibitions were widely followed or simply scared the more devout. But you can bet they caused plenty of anxiety for newlyweds trying to figure out the logistics without risking eternal damnation. Now, what counted as a major sin versus a whoopsie that depended. Intercourse during menstruation was considered not only a sin but a health hazard. It was believed to poison crops, warp unborn babies, or infect the man's soul. The logic was hazy, but the panic was real. Similarly, intimacy during daylight hours was frowned upon, especially if birds could see you. Yes, that's a real warning from a 13th century priest. He claimed animals witnessing sinful acts would carry the image with them, causing nature itself to rebel. There were also taboos around times and places. Church altars were strictly off limits for obvious reasons, but some took this further, saying, even within sight of a crucifix was problematic. Some households covered religious images or icons with cloth during marital acts, just in case St. Francis didn't want front row seats. And if you live near a cemetery, forget it. The dead were believed to be extremely judgmental. Medieval people also had firm ideas about what went where and why. Non-procreative acts, even between married couples, were often condemned as sodomy, a term that was far broader back then and included pretty much anything outside the narrowly approved method. In extreme cases, couples were excommunicated, fined, or forced to undergo public penance. Think standing barefoot in church holding a candle while a bishop scowled at you. Definitely a mood killer. And then there were beliefs about what intimacy could cause. Some thought that conceiving a child in certain seasons would influence their personality. Winter babies were said to be cold-hearted, summer babies impulsive and rash. Conceiving during a thunderstorm, that child might be born with a temper or the ability to speak to snakes. Of course, none of this was based on science, but when your midwife's main source of knowledge is herbal lore and old wives' tales, everything seems plausible. Animals, too, weren't spared from the gossip. It was said that a dog sleeping in the marital bed could cause impotence. Cats, they stole your soul during climax. Chickens were relatively safe unless they crowed during the act. Then it was bad luck for 7 years. And don't even think about doing anything intimate during an eclipse. That was a cosmic no, guaranteed to produce a deformed child, or at least a very awkward family meal. People also believed that certain foods before intimacy could curse or bless the event. Beans were a gamble. Some said they encouraged fertility, others warned they clouded the humors. Garlic was protective, but only if chewed by both partners. Onions, oddly, were said to make you forget your station, which could mean anything from forgetting your chores to committing socially inappropriate acts with the stable hand. And let's not forget the truly niche taboos. One medieval text warned against looking at a mirror right after intimacy lest your reflection shatter the soul. Another claimed that whispering another person's name during the act would summon demons unless that name was a saint's, in which case it was just confusing. Despite all these restrictions, people still did what people do, but the fear lingered. Fear of divine punishment, fear of infertility, fear of being labeled unclean or unnatural. These tabos weren't just private, they were social. You could be shunned, judged, or mocked for breaking them, even in the privacy of your own home. And that pressure seeped into the psyche, shaping how people saw themselves, their partners, and their bodies. Yet within the madness, there was a strange consistency. Almost all these taboos pointed to the idea that sex was powerful, too powerful to be left unchecked. Whether it summoned demons or soured your butter, it had consequences, and controlling it through fear, myth, or prayer was seen as a form of protection. So tonight, as you drift off in a world with fewer rules and significantly less goat-related superstition, be grateful for the freedom to learn, explore, and laugh at the past's peculiar paranoia. And maybe close the curtains just in case the neighbor's rooster is unusually judgmental. You're sitting in a candle-lit chamber, nibbling on a hunk of rye bread and watching your lord's daughter sneak a folded note into her bodice. She's been exchanging letters with a stable boy, a reckless move, but not unheard of. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just about passion. It was a minefield of power, piety, and paperwork. That's right. Forbidden love came with consequences, especially when it crossed class lines or challenged the church's very specific expectations. The idea of love for love's sake wasn't exactly mainstream. Marriages, particularly among the nobility, were political tools. They secured alliances, transferred property, and ensured dynastic continuity, a romantic spark. There was a nice bonus if you were lucky, but for most, love was something you discovered or didn't after the wedding. Yet people still fell in love in all the wrong ways. A blacksmith's apprentice might pine for a merchant's daughter. A cloistered nun might harbor feelings for the handsome priest delivering morning mass. And when these feelings were acted upon, the fallout could be dramatic, public, and weirdly theatrical. Historians still argue whether such forbidden romances were common or just popular story material, but medieval literature is absolutely packed with them. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinea, even the Romance of the Rose, a racy allegory about seduction hidden inside a garden. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were cautionary, aspirational, and sometimes scandalously sympathetic to the rule-breakers. Take, for example, the case of a ballad and Heloise scholar and student clergyman and young noble woman. Their secret affair and tragic fallout, he was castrated. She was sent to a convent where the stuff of legend, but their letters filled with longing and regret survived. And they show something surprising, a genuine emotional connection, intellectual respect and heartbreak. In a time when love was rarely private, their private words became public legacy, but not all forbidden love was romantic. Some relationships were born of necessity, isolation, or opportunity. A lady-in-waiting might find herself drawn to another woman in her household. A monk isolated in silence might seek comfort in a fellow brother's company. These situations were deeply taboo, and the penalties, if discovered, were severe. Church doctrine was unambiguous. Same-sex intimacy was labeled a grave sin. Theologians wrote lengthy treatises on the unnaturalness of such acts, often borrowing language from Roman law and layering it with fire and brimstone flare. Accused individuals might face flogging imprisonment or exile. In some regions, repeat offenders could be burned at the stake, not always for the act itself, but for defying church authority. And yet, some scholars suggest the rules were enforced unevenly. Monasteries, for example, were spaces where emotional bonds often grew intense. Letters between monks sometimes blur the lines between friendship and romance. Were they coded confessions, innocent affection? Historians still argue whether these documents reveal hidden queer histories or simply reflect different cultural norms around male intimacy. Outside of same-sex relationships, forbidden love also included consanguinity, that is, falling for someone too closely related. The church had strict rules about who could marry whom. Initially, you couldn't marry anyone within 7 degrees of kinship. That's basically half the village. Even third or fourth cousins were off limits without papal dispensation, and tracing those relationships required serious math. Got a crush on your father's cousin's son's wife's niece? Better check the family tree twice. These rules weren't just about purity, they were about inheritance. Keeping property in the right hands, avoiding alliances that might consolidate too much power. So, when love threatened those plans, it wasn't just frowned upon, it was forcibly untangled. Still, people tried. Secret marriages happened. Eopments occurred. Some couples went to great lengths to create paper trails that justified their union, falsifying birth records, bribing priests, or getting married in faraway towns under assumed names. And when they got caught, the punishment might be annulment, excommunication, or for the especially bold, public humiliation. And then there were clerical romances. Priests were supposed to be celibate, monks and nuns too. But not all followed the rules. Some kept mistresses, even children. The church condemned this fiercely, but enforcement was spotty. In some regions, communities turned a blind eye so long as the priests still performed baptisms and funerals on time. There's even evidence of clandestine marriages performed by rebellious clergy. These were real marriages in the eyes of God and the couple, but illegal without a bishop's approval. The church despised them. So did angry fathers, but lovers in love. They didn't always wait for permission. Poets romanticized these transgressions. They framed forbidden love as noble suffering, as passion too intense to be restrained. The logic was hazy, but the panic was real. Similarly, intimacy during daylight hours was frowned upon, especially if birds could see you. Yes, that's a real warning from a 13th century priest. He claimed animals witnessing sinful acts would carry the image with them, causing nature itself to rebel. There were also taboos around times and places. Church altars were strictly off limits for obvious reasons, but some took this further, saying, even within sight of a crucifix was problematic. Some households covered religious images or icons with cloth during marital acts, just in case St. Francis didn't want front row seats. And if you live near a cemetery, forget it. The dead were believed to be extremely judgmental. Medieval people also had firm ideas about what went where and why. Non-procreative acts, even between married couples, were often condemned as sodomy, a term that was far broader back then and included pretty much anything outside the narrowly approved method. In extreme cases, couples were excommunicated, fined, or forced to undergo public penance. Think standing barefoot in church holding a candle while a bishop scowled at you. Definitely a mood killer. And then there were beliefs about what intimacy could cause. Some thought that conceiving a child in certain seasons would influence their personality. Winter babies were said to be cold-hearted, summer babies impulsive and rash. Conceiving during a thunderstorm, that child might be born with a temper or the ability to speak to snakes. Of course, none of this was based on science, but when your midwife's main source of knowledge is herbal lore and old wives' tales, everything seems plausible. Animals, too, weren't spared from the gossip. It was said that a dog sleeping in the marital bed could cause impotence. Cats, they stole your soul during climax. Chickens were relatively safe unless they crowed during the act. Then it was bad luck for 7 years. And don't even think about doing anything intimate during an eclipse. That was a cosmic no, guaranteed to produce a deformed child, or at least a very awkward family meal. People also believed that certain foods before intimacy could curse or bless the event. Beans were a gamble. Some said they encouraged fertility, others warned they clouded the humors. Garlic was protective, but only if chewed by both partners. Onions, oddly, were said to make you forget your station, which could mean anything from forgetting your chores to committing socially inappropriate acts with the stable hand. And let's not forget the truly niche taboos. One medieval text warned against looking at a mirror right after intimacy lest your reflection shatter the soul. Another claimed that whispering another person's name during the act would summon demons unless that name was a saint's, in which case it was just confusing. Despite all these restrictions, people still did what people do, but the fear lingered. Fear of divine punishment, fear of infertility, fear of being for 7 nights under a waxing moon. Another involved writing their name backward on an egg, then burying it at a crossroads while whispering a rhyme. Eggs were a recurring theme. So were crossroads and whispering. Lots of whispering. If you wanted things to go a bit more forcefully, you could try a binding spell. These were used to make someone physically crave you. Some involved knots, twisting red cords while chanting phrases in Latin, or, in some cases, absolute gibberish that sounded magical. Others called for carving symbols into candles, lighting them at night and letting them burn down while imagining your target in vivid detail. Fire desire and wax figurines. It's like an early Gothic Tinder. And it wasn't just women doing this. Men sought magical help too, especially if they felt rejected, emasculated, or just plain unlucky. One 14th century charm advised bachelors to rub their feet with basil oil, then step into the footprints of the woman they desired. Apparently, this transferred heat and intention through the souls. Less creepy than some methods, more likely to confuse the local cobbler, but there were risks. If caught practicing love magic, you could be accused of sorcery, a crime often tied to heresy. Punishments ranged from penance and public shaming to imprisonment, or in extreme cases, execution. The church wasn't fond of people meddling with free will, especially when romance was involved. One bishop declared that love spells were doors through which demons crawl giggling into our bed sheets, which, let's admit, would be a terrifying pillowcase design. Despite the danger, people kept trying, and the line between magic and medicine blurred constantly. Some spells were disguised as remedies or folk prayers. Others hid in plain sight blessings that doubled as incantations, charms stitched into clothing, prayers repeated under the breath with suspicious specificity. And then there were love curses spells designed not to attract but to repel. Jilted lovers might hire a local wise woman to cool the heart of their rival. Some used cursed herbs like henbane or wolfsbane, mixing them into food or drink never recommended. Others invoked saints in bizarrely petty ways, like begging Saint Dinah to give your ex terrible breath or an itchy foot. It was magical vengeance on a very human scale. Even within the church, not everyone was immune to magical thinking. Monks copied texts filled with protective charms. Nuns wore amulets shaped like hearts or eyes. And though most clergy condemned love magic in theory, in practice, they often treated it like a sin of desperation. Wrong, yes, but understandable. Affairs of the heart. One confessor wrote, "Turn even the pious into fools." By the late Middle Ages, love magic began merging with courtly rituals. Nobles might exchange rings enchanted by wandering mystics. Queens commissioned astrologers to select the best night for conception. Kings wore charms under their armor, not just for protection, but to keep their lovers loyal. It wasn't just peasant superstition. It had climbed the social ladder. So tonight, as you nestle into your blankets and the shadows stretch like soft ribbon across the walls, imagine those quiet figures at midnight tying knots, lighting candles, whispering names into the wind. Not out of evil, but out of yearning, out of hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe was listening and that love, like magic, could be summoned with the right words at the right time. You're seated in a darkened cathedral, its stone walls echoing with the low hum of chanting. Incense coils through the air like spirit smoke. But you're not here for mass. You're here to confess, and not just any sin. Oh no. Tonight's confession involves the quiet shame of carnal error. Because in the Middle Ages, your local priest didn't just worry about your gossiping or your stolen apples. He wanted to know exactly how, when, and why you'd broken the church's complex and often bizarre rules on sexuality. Welcome to the medieval confession booth, a place where privacy met precision and where your bedroom decisions were evaluated with theological rigor. Let's start with the framework. By the 12th century, the church had standardized the sacrament of confession. Every Christian was expected to confess at least once a year, especially before Easter, and sexual sins. Those topped the list. Not just adultery, mind you, though. That was a whopper. But everything from impure thoughts to improper marital enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether confessions were truly as detailed as the manual suggests, or whether they were more general in practice. But the guides left behind, called penitentials, tell a fascinating, often eyeing story. These books were written by clergy for clergy, offering step-by-step instructions on how to question, categorize, and punish a wide variety of sins. One popular 9th century text begins with, "First ask the penitent if he has committed fornication and with whom woman, man, beast, or inanimate object." You read that right. They were thorough, and the questions didn't stop at, "Did you?" They went into the how, the when, and the why. Had you sinned with your spouse on a holy day, used a non-approved position, experienced too much pleasure, thought lustful thoughts during prayer? Congratulations, you owed penance. Some questions were oddly specific. One penitential asked whether the man had removed himself before a mission for the purpose of avoiding conception. If so, penance. Another asked whether a woman had used herbs or concoctions to prevent the seed from taking root. Again, penance. Even wearing perfume to entice a man to unclean thought could be considered sinful, and don't think being married gave you a free pass. One particularly stern guide insisted that even within marriage, sex should be rare, solemn, and unaccompanied by joy. It suggested couples should only unite for the purpose of procreation, and even then with prayer and sorrow. The ultimate medieval dirty talk was probably something like, "Shall we fulfill our marital duty with remorse and moderate haste?" Confessors were trained to look for signs of indulgence. Too many children, you were blessed. Too few suspicious. If you had none, you might be questioned about your intent. Were you avoiding God's plan? Were you using potions or spells? Or worse, enjoying the act too much? Punishments varied. A minor offense might earn you a week of bread and water or several dozen recitations of the Lord's Prayer. But graver sins could mean months of fasting exclusion from communion or pilgrimages to holy sites. In some cases, if the sin involved clerics or religious vows, you could be publicly humiliated or permanently reassigned to another monastery where your eyes may wander less. Women, too, were expected to confess with excruciating honesty. Midwives were interrogated about whether they'd ever helped prevent a pregnancy or deliver a child in secret. Wives were asked whether they'd ever refused their husbands out of laziness or sought excessive pleasure. One female penitent was reportedly made to crawl the length of the church nave after confessing to wearing silk stockings to attract attention. And this wasn't even during a service, just a regular Tuesday, but not all confessors were harsh. Some showed compassion, especially toward those clearly struggling with guilt or confusion. They offered advice, reassurance, and occasionally actual counseling about relationships. A few monks even wrote pastoral letters acknowledging the difficulty of celibacy, the complexity of desire, and the basic human need for connection. Of course, there were also fake confessors. Quacks who traveled between villages offering absolution in exchange for coins or favors. They sometimes gave hilariously light penance in return for scandalous confessions. 3 Hail Marys and a goose feather, and you're forgiven. These frauds infuriated the church but remained popular, especially among those tired of being grilled like a sinner on a spit. Confession wasn't always private either. In small communities, everyone knew who was going to the priest and when. A sudden visit after market day might suggest something happened behind the apple cart. And while priests were supposed to keep confessions, secret rumors often swirled. Some towns even had nicknames for regular penitents like Twice a Week Walter or Margery the Murmurer. And yet, despite the awkwardness, confession was deeply embedded in medieval life. It offered a release valve, a moment of honesty in a world governed by strict rules and heavy expectations. It reminded people that they weren't alone in their struggles and that even the worst slip-up could be forgiven for the right number of prayers and a little public humility. So tonight, as the darkness deepens and no one asks you to list your sins in order of seriousness, be grateful for your peaceful, penance-free pillow. And remember that in another time, someone might have spent their Thursday night confessing to St. Jerome's assistant that they once looked too long at the baker's apprentice. You awaken to the clanging of bells from the monastery down the lane. The rhythmic tolling reminding every soul in town that today is a holy day. But you've already been up for hours. Your spouse insisted on avoiding eye contact during breakfast, muttering something about St. Agnes and divine judgment. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, certain days, seasons, and celestial signs were believed to have extraordinary influence over your love life. Yes, timing was everything, and not just for planting crops or avoiding the plague. Medieval people believed there were right and wrong times to get frisky, fall in love, or even think impure thoughts. Let's start with the liturgical calendar. As we've seen before, the church laid down rules about when sex was forbidden. But beyond those general prohibitions, entire seasons were thought to affect passion. Lent, for example, was a time of denial and purification. Couples were expected to abstain sometimes for 40 full days. Advent, too, was a season of preparation. Then there were rogation days, ember days, and a dozen other feast-linked occasions during which carnal acts were frowned upon. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were widely obeyed or quietly ignored. Certainly, many people tried to follow the rules. Some kept elaborate calendars, not just for prayer, but for tracking their approved windows. One particularly devout household supposedly marked a wooden beam above their bed with chalk red lines for no green lines for go. Not exactly subtle, but practical. Then there were the celestial factors. Medieval astrology wasn't a novelty, it was mainstream science. Physicians consulted the stars before surgeries. Farmers planted by moon phase and lovers. They scheduled intimacy based on the movement of the planets. If Venus was in the house of Mars, passion was said to burn too hot, leading to arguments or even spiritual harm. Better to wait until Venus aligned with Jupiter for a more harmonious vibe. Yes, medieval astrology had big Mercury retrograde energy. Books called lunaria helped couples track the moon's position to determine fertility and temperament. Conceiving under a waxing moon might bring a healthy child, while a waning moon risked weakness or misfortune. Some guides even suggested specific hours of the day for procreation, usually tied to which archangel was said to be watching at the time, which sounds romantic until you realize you're waiting for Gabriel's hour, while trying not to sneeze on your candle. Seasons mattered, too. Spring was associated with rebirth and energy, fertile both literally and metaphorically. Summer brought risk, though some believed children conceived in summer would be too fiery, too impulsive. Autumn, a mixed bag. Winter cold, unpredictable, potentially cursed. One 14th century German text warns that winter conceptions lead to brooding spirits and thin blood. Not ideal. Of course, none of this stopped people from doing what people do, but it did influence how they felt about the outcomes. A child born on the wrong day might be feared as unlucky or melancholic. A marriage that began under the wrong sign might be blamed for decades of disharmony. It wasn't just poor choices, it was the stars. And if you were truly unlucky, you might be born on a forbidden day. Fridays especially. Good Friday were considered terrible for both intimacy and birth. Monday was marginal, too close to the Sabbath. Tuesdays were chaotic. Wednesday was fine. Thursday better, but Saturday, oddly, was both quietly approved and possibly heretical, depending on whom you asked. One wildly specific tradition in parts of France declared that intimacy during a thunderstorm risked calling down demonic forces. Another warned that if lightning struck nearby while you were a Himid activity, the child would be born with red eyes and an aversion to prayer. Even the weather had opinions. Want to spice things up? Some believed that certain cosmic events enhanced passion. A bright comet was thought to stir the blood. A meteor shower could increase wanting dreams. Eclipses were more controversial. Some thought they made people frenzied and bold, while others swore they caused impotence. In other words, if the sky was doing something dramatic, expect your bedroom to follow suit. But not all timing rules came from fear. There were folk traditions meant to bless romantic encounters. For example, some couples believed that making love on May Day morning just as the sun rose would ensure a fertile year and strengthen the bond between them. Others waited for Beltane, a pagan-rooted holiday celebrated with bonfires and, let's say, enthusiastic dancing. Even after the church tried to suppress these festivals, their popularity endured. likely because they offered something the other 300-plus no-touch days didn't permission. In towns where older customs survived, people whispered about which saints were sympathetic. Saint Valentine, of course, was invoked for lovers, but also Saint Agnes, Saint Dwinwyn, and even Saint Margaret, depending on the region. Some households hung herbs by the door, lavender for love, rue for chastity, mugwort for honestly no one really knew, but it smelled mystical. They didn't just schedule their feelings, they tried to engineer them. Even dreams were timed. Some believed that sleeping on certain days would produce visions of one's future lover. Sunday nights were ideal, Thursdays risky. If you dreamt of water, it meant love. If you dreamt of fire desire, if you dreamt of bread, we'll maybe have a snack before bed next time. So tonight, as your head nestles into the pillow and the night sky stretches far above you, consider this. In a world ruled by rules, rituals, and rhythms, even love was on a clock. You weren't just choosing when to be close. You were listening to the stars, the saints, and your own grandmother's calendar. And somehow, against all odds, the human heart still found time to skip a beat. You're strolling down a narrow alley, the kind that snakes behind the cathedral and between the bathhouse and the alewife shop. It's twilight, and behind closed shutters, you can hear laughter, low, rhythmic, and unmistakably adult. You've just wandered near one of the most controversial, yet undeniably central parts of medieval society, the brothel. Yes, despite centuries of church preaching and moral posturing, medieval towns had entire districts quietly, sometimes loudly dedicated to the world's oldest profession. And while the line between sin and service was always blurry, brothel weren't hidden dens of debauchery. Often they were licensed, regulated, and in some cases funded by the very authorities who preached against them. Let's peel back the curtain on this strange, paradoxical world. Medieval brothel came in many forms. Some were elegant, multi-story houses staffed by seasoned workers who wore fine fabrics and knew how to pour wine just right. Others were dingy back rooms and inns filled with straw and the faint scent of regret. But all operated in an uneasy truce between desire, necessity, and official denial. Historians still argue whether the majority of brothel were tolerated out of pragmatism or quietly encouraged as moral safety valves. In cities like Paris, London, and Florence, municipal records show that brothel were taxed, their madams licensed, and their workers even provided with certain legal protections. A 14th century law in Avignon required brothel to fly a red banner because apparently subtlety was not a medieval strength. You'd think this open acceptance would mean society viewed sex work with neutrality, but no, it was tangled in stigma and contradiction. Brothel workers were considered impure, sinful, and socially dead. They were often barred from marrying owning land or wearing certain colors like scarlet, which was ironically also used to mark elite courtesans. Many were forced into the trade through poverty, abandonment, or orphanhood. And yet at the same time, they were a key part of the city's economy. The church officially condemned prostitution. Of course, theologians wrote long-winded treatises comparing it to a sewer for sin or a necessary evil to protect the innocent. One even likened brothel to public latrines, disgusting but preferable to public defecation. Comforting. And yet some church leaders quietly supported licensed brothel, arguing that regulating sin was better than pretending it didn't exist. One bishop in Vienna is rumored to have funded the construction of a brothel near a monastery, citing the preservation of monly discipline. Whether that's apocryphal or just very on-brand for the 13th century, it reflects a deeper truth. These places existed because people used them regularly. Brothel was sometimes used as quasi-clinics. Midwives and herbalists worked there, tending to women's health in ways society otherwise ignored. Some workers learned medical knowledge, how to soothe infections, apply puses, or prepare rudimentary contraception using things like wild carrot seeds, pennyroyal, or vinegar-soaked cloths. Was it effective? Debatable? Was it their only option? Often, yes. And here's the truly medieval twist. Some brothel workers were trained entertainers. They sang, danced, played music, even recited poetry. In courtly circles, these skills elevated certain women to the role of courtesan, a kind of romantic freelancer who might accompany a nobleman for weeks, acting as companion confidant and very unofficial therapist. Of course, not every story ends in music and moonlight. Life inside the brothel could be brutal. Many workers were exploited unpaid or indebted to madams who acted more like loan sharks. Fines for lateness, gossiping, or smiling too often weren't uncommon, and there was always the threat of disease. Syphilis wasn't widely recognized yet, but gonorrhea and other infections were rampant, and treatments ranged from ineffective herbs to terrifying metal instruments. Still, many towns had a complicated fondness for their red light districts. Local festivals sometimes passed right by them. One chronicle from Bruges describes a town crier inviting all men of decent coin and in decent mind to the brothel quarter after sunset. The event was technically part of a Saints' Day celebration because nothing says piety like a parade of ale and innuendo. Yet even within this world, rules applied. Brothels were often located outside city walls or near rivers, not just for discretion, but for easy removal if things got out of hand. And workers were expected to observe the same religious fasts and feast day abstinences as everyone else. That meant no business during Lent Advent or any major saint's day, unless of course someone paid extra and nobody told the bishop. Interestingly, not all brothel workers saw themselves as damned. Some prayed regularly, gave alms, and hoped for redemption. One famous woman, Mary of Egypt, was a prostitute turned saint. Her story, whether exaggerated or not, inspired countless others to seek spiritual peace. Some brothel even had little shrines where workers lit candles between clients and whispered prayers they didn't dare speak aloud. Eventually, the tide turned. The late Middle Ages saw growing pressure from reformers who wanted to shut brothel down. Moral panic mingled with disease outbreaks, and city officials, now more image-conscious, began to quietly dismantle what they once supported. But the memory lingered. So tonight, as the hush of sleep settles around you, think of those flickering rooms behind the city walls of laughter, tears, music, and the complicated truth of desire lived on the margins. And whether you see it as sin, survival, or simply another human story, remember that history's most whispered chapters often say the most. You're watching from a shadowy pew as a wedding unfolds in the village chapel. Candles, flickering veils, fluttering, and a suspiciously nervous groom adjusting his belt for the fourth time. The priest raises his hands to bless the union, and the crowd leans in not just to witness the vows, but to see if the couple actually know what they're getting into. Because in the Middle Ages, a wedding wasn't the end of the love story. It was often the beginning of a long, legally complicated, socially scrutinized, and sometimes utterly baffling chapter involving sex consent and strange rituals. The church took marriage seriously, very seriously. It was one of the 7 sacraments ordained by God and directly tied to the idea of procreation and salvation. But the actual rules around marriage were far more chaotic than you might expect. First off, there was no requirement for witnesses, a priest, or even a ceremony until the 13th century. As long as both parties said, "I take you as my spouse." That was it. Bam. Married. Whisper it behind a barn. Married. Say it in Latin, French, or mime it awkwardly across a fish stall. Still married. Historians still argue whether this consensual marriage model was a disaster or a surprisingly modern approach. Either way, it led to a lot of, he said. She said confusion. If one partner later denied the vows were exchanged, court cases followed, some of which involved dragging in witnesses who may or may not have seen the couple holding hands near a well 6 years earlier. Eventually, the church cracked down. By the 1200s, it required marriages to be public witnessed and officiated by a priest. But the emphasis remained on consent. If either party didn't agree, the union wasn't valid. Yes, the same church that frowned on lace-up boots and smiling during Lent was surprisingly progressive about mutual agreement. That said, defining consent wasn't always straightforward. In cases where girls were married off at age 12 or boys at 14, there was debate about whether they were old enough to truly understand what they were agreeing to. One court case famously reversed a marriage because the bride had consented under confusion, thinking she was agreeing to borrow a goat. And then there were the tests of consummation. As you'll remember from earlier, because how could you forget sex was a crucial part of marriage? No consummation, no validity. That led to awkward rituals where families or priests would literally watch the couple walk into the bedroom post-wedding, sometimes accompanied by songs, snacks, and encouraging nods. Think of it as a group project nobody wanted to lead. In some regions, a priest would bless the marriage bed. In others, newlyweds had to display the post-nuptial sheets to prove they'd done the deed. And yes, there were entire folk songs devoted to whether the bride sang sweetly the next morning. The Middle Ages were many things. Subtle was not one of them. Sex within marriage had its own rule book. As always, it had to be for procreation, not pleasure. Spouses were required to be open to children, even if none arrived. And if a husband refused to fulfill his marital duty, the wife could take him to court, literally. In one famous case, a man had to stand before a jury of matrons who judged whether his credentials were functional. Spoiler, he failed. Annulment granted. There were also strange rituals meant to ensure fertility. One involved placing a holy relic under the mattress. Another called for the bride to drink milk from a cow that had given birth that spring. If nothing worked, couples might visit a local saint's shrine and sleep on the ground beside it, hoping for divine intervention, or at least a dream with helpful instructions. One surprisingly common belief was that naming your children before conception could invite their soul. Couples would write names on parchment and place it beneath their pillow on their wedding night. If the child was born healthy, the chosen name stuck. If not, well, they tried again. Love, luck, and mild superstition all bundled into one linen sheet. Of course, not all marriages were based on love. Many were arranged, especially among the nobility. Politics, land, and dowries drove the union's not fluttery feelings. But that didn't mean affection couldn't grow. Letters survive of husbands and wives who developed deep bonds over time, even starting as strangers. Others, not so lucky, stayed locked in cold contractual arrangements while secretly longing for someone else. And when love turned to loathing, divorce, as we understand it today, didn't exist, but annulments could be granted under certain conditions. Non-consummation forced consent, consanguinity, or spiritual vows. That meant if one partner secretly joined a convent or monastery, the marriage could be undone. It was the medieval equivalent of ghosting, except with tonsure and incense. Wives were expected to obey. Husbands were expected to provide, but both had duties, including the dreaded marital debt. That's right. If one partner wanted intimacy, the other was supposed to oblige, no matter the mood. This obligation went both ways and was surprisingly egalitarian, at least in theory. Reality, of course, varied wildly. So tonight, as the flicker of candlelight dances across your walls and no one demands a signed sheet as proof of affection, consider the medieval couple starting their life together. Under layers of pressure, ritual, and rumor. Their love, like yours, was shaped by the world around them, but also by small, defiant choices made behind closed doors. Choices that whispered, "This is ours. Just ours." You're walking down a cobblestone street just before dawn, and you notice a figure slipping into the back entrance of the local apothecary. Nothing too strange except she's clutching a bundle of dried herbs, a worn velvet pouch, and the kind of look that says, "This conversation never happened." Because in the Middle Ages, when the official advice was just don't, people still turned to folk remedies, secret knowledge and backdoor solutions to manage their sex lives. Let's talk about contraception and fertility control, a deeply whispered, highly risky but very real part of medieval experience. Church doctrine was clear: any attempt to block conception was a grave sin, an offense not only against your body, but against God's plan. Sex was meant for procreation, anything else was dangerous, and yet, human nature being what it is, pushed back. People didn't always want more children. Sometimes they weren't ready. Sometimes they weren't married. And sometimes, let's face it, they were just practical. So, they turned to alternative knowledge. Some of it based in ancient texts, some passed down through generations of midwives, herbalists, and cunning folk. These remedies were rarely written down. When they were, they often appeared in coded language buried inside books about agriculture or saints' lives. Historians still argue whether these practices were effective or more symbolic. But the documentation, spotty as it is, shows a rich of shadowy world of natural contraceptives, withdrawal methods, magical charms, and even proto-condoms made of animal intestines or linen soaked in herbal infusions. Let's start with the herbs. Some plants were believed to suppress ovulation or interfere with implantation. Sulfium, a plant now extinct, was famously used in the Roman world as a contraceptive and was likely still whispered about centuries later. Other contenders included pennyroyal, rue wild carrot seeds, and juniper berries, all used in tinctures, teas, or tices. Some were ingested, some were placed in the vagina, and most came with stern warnings. Do not use on holy days. Avoid if pregnant, or only mix with water from a sacred well. Withdrawal, though condemned by theologians, was widely practiced. It was seen as a lesser evil than full abstinence, especially within marriage. One penitential text hilariously scolded couples for spilling seed with intention, but acknowledged that the sin is grievous, yet not always avoidable. In other words, even the clergy kind of got it. Then there were amulets and charms. A woman might wear a stone etched with astrological symbols, or a folded parchment containing verses from the Book of Psalms, blessed between womb and tomb. One spell read. Another involved binding a rooster feather with red thread and tying it around the thigh before bed. Was it effective? No idea. Did it help women feel in control of their bodies in a world that rarely gave them that right? Absolutely. Condom-like devices did exist, though they were rare and often reused. Yikes. They were usually made from sheep, gut tied with ribbon and washed carefully between uses. Not so much for contraception as for protection from disease, especially an urban brothel. A few surviving medical texts mention sheaths for lentious men, and one even includes instructions: boil the bladder of a goat dry and sew with silk. If that doesn't scream romance, I don't know what does. Abortion, of course, was hugely taboo, but still practiced. The Church's stance evolved over the centuries, at one point distinguishing between formed and unformed fetuses, a classification drawn from Aristotle, no less. Some clerics condemned all abortion as murder. Others debated the timing of ensoulment. Meanwhile, women turned to their community healers, who offered restorative tonics to bring down the moon blood. No one said the A word. Everyone knew what was meant. Punishments for using or providing contraception ranged from confession and penance to, in extreme cases, excommunication or public shaming. Yet these measures didn't stop the practices. They just pushed them underground, where knowledge was passed through coded stories, whispered instructions, or embroidered symbols. A plant stitched into a hem, a bracelet with 7 knots, a recipe shared only between sisters, and let's not forget the role of men. They too sought ways to avoid fatherhood, sometimes through charm carrying, sometimes through superstition. One English farmer was said to sleep with a smooth stone under his pillow to cool the loins. Others wore belts with religious relics sewn inside, hoping divine protection would equal divine prevention. It's not how any of this works, obviously, but desperation leads to creativity. Interestingly, not all church figures were totally anti-prevention. A few sympathetic priests turned a blind eye when couples confessed using timing or herbal drinks. One even wrote, "Better to love in caution than to breed in bitterness." It wasn't doctrine, but it was human. By the late Middle Ages, knowledge around fertility began to shift again, influenced by translations of Arabic medical texts and renewed interest in anatomy. But the core tension remained: desire for control in a system that offered none. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed, maybe reflect on the quiet courage of those who tried to steer their own futures with roots recipes and a healthy dose of whispered wisdom. In a world where your choices were limited and your body not quite your own, they found ways messy, imperfect, and hidden to say, "This part of me, I decide." You stir in your sleep, caught in that dreamy limbo where time feels like candle wax slowly melting. Somewhere in the mist, a bell tolls and you find yourself in a peculiar courtroom, not one of justice, but of scandal. The air is thick with parchment and perfume. A clerk leans in and says, "Today's hearing, marital misconduct, unusual cravings, and one case of excessive singing after dark." Because, believe it or not, the church courts and moral enforcers of the Middle Ages were very interested in your sex life. Let's talk about how intimate behavior, whether whispered in bedrooms or shouted across markets, could become a public matter scrutinized not just by priests, but by bureaucrats, nosy neighbors, and the occasional archbishop with a flair for drama. By the 13th century, ecclesiastical courts had evolved into powerful institutions that regulated marriage, sexuality, and moral conduct across Europe. If you committed adultery, married improperly, refused to fulfill your marital duties, or were caught living with someone as if wed, you could be summoned. And when the church called you, showed up. Historians still argue whether these courts aim to truly reform behavior or simply assert clerical authority. But the records they left behind are extensive and weirdly fascinating. Thousands of cases documenting everything from fornication to incest to lewd dancing survive in brittle Latin script. Some are tragic, some are absurd, some sound like bad sitcoms. Take, for example, the case of Martha of Lincoln, who was fined for climbing out the window of her betrothed's room at dawn while laughing. The charge: scandalous cohabitation. Another man was excommunicated after refusing to confess that his wife snored in an unladylike fashion, which allegedly tempted him to sin elsewhere. No word on whether she got a rebuttal. Confessors too played a role in enforcement. If someone admitted a serious sin, say adultery or sodomy, the priest might refer them to the bishop's court. There they'd undergo interrogation, public penance, or in some cases be forced to wear a shame garment, a tunic painted with symbolic flames chains, or if the offense was really juicy, tiny devils poking at tender spots. Medieval fashion was not subtle. Public penance was a big deal. Sinners might be made to walk barefoot through town carrying candles. Some wore placards announcing their sins. Others had to kneel at church doors during Mass, while townsfolk walked past whispering prayers or insults. If you ever dreamed of being the main character in your own slow-motion scandal scene, this was it. There were also morality patrols. In some cities, officials called syndics wardens or morality officers would roam the streets at night, checking for improper behavior. Couples caught embracing too passionately, dancing too closely, or loitering near bathhouse after curfew could be questioned. If found guilty, they were fined, flogged, or made to recite psalms under supervision. A few cities even imposed bedtime bells, not for safety, but to encourage people to go home and sin privately. The brothel workers we met earlier were also frequently dragged into court, not just for working, but for working on Sundays or refusing to close during Lent. One poor woman was fined for laughing inappropriately while wearing yellow, a color associated with lust. Her defense: the sun was out, case dismissed. Even married couples weren't safe. Spouses could sue each other for non-performance, excessive jealousy, or cruelty of the tongue. In one famous case, a wife accused her husband of neglecting her for 3 months. Her evidence, she'd place small threads between the bed sheets each night to see if they were disturbed. Medieval intimacy had receipts. Sometimes people brought charges out of revenge. A spurned lover might accuse their ex of sorcery, unnatural acts, or breaking a secret vow. One 15th century woman claimed her former suitor had promised marriage in exchange for 6 months of favor, then married someone else. She brought the case before the archbishop, who ruled in her favor, and fined the man 4 sheep. Justice in fleece form. And, yes, there were queer cases too. Although heavily condemned, same-sex relationships did surface in court records, usually charged under the umbrella of sodomy. These trials were often vague, coded, or described with euphemisms like unchaste familiarity. Punishments ranged from public penance to exile, but the rarity of actual prosecutions suggests enforcement was inconsistent depending on region mood and how public the behavior had been. Not all outcomes were bleak. Some courts showed compassion, especially toward women or those genuinely penitent. A pregnant woman abandoned by her lover might receive protection. A repentant man could have his sentence reduced if he donated to a monastery or paid for candles. Justice wasn't always blind, but it was occasionally generous. Still, the lesson was clear. Your private life was never entirely private. At any moment, love lust or one wrong smirk could land you in front of a robed panel with quills, scrolls, and very little patience. So tonight, as you sink deeper beneath your blanket and feel the soft hush of solitude, be grateful for the silence, for the freedom to be yourself without fear of candlelit judgment, and for the sheer relief that your neighbors can't drag you to court for humming too suggestively near the cheese stall. You blink slowly, tucked into the calm hush of twilight, and hear the distant toll of bells, soft, measured, and fading. Somewhere beyond the veil of sleep, the medieval world is packing up its scandalous scrolls, folding its relic-laced bedding, and quietly extinguishing its wax-drip torches. Tonight, as our strange and sleepy journey ends, we descend into the most curious chamber of all the collective imagination of the past, where myths, warnings, and wildly wrong medical theories shaped everything people believed about sex. By the end of the Middle Ages, sex had been so twisted through doctrine, folklore, and medicine that it barely resembled anything we'd recognize today. It was not just a physical act. It was a metaphysical risk, a social negotiation, and an ongoing battlefield of the soul. Let's start with the physicians. While some medieval thinkers like the scholars of Cerno or Avisa's followers tried to ground sexuality in anatomy and humor theory, the results were often a mix of the insightful and the absurd. For instance, it was widely believed that women had to experience pleasure in order to conceive. The female orgasm wasn't a dirty secret. It was a requirement for fertility, progressive almost, except this was also used to accuse barren women of being frigid or impure. And then there was seed theory. Many believed men and women both contributed seeds during intercourse, and a child's characteristics depended on which seed was stronger or which partner enjoyed it more. One 15th century text warned that if a woman climaxed after the man, her seed would spoil the child's nature, leading to daughters with strong wills or sons with female softness, because clearly that's how science works. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincerely held or just repeated out of tradition, but they shaped everything from marital advice to court rulings to midwifery practices. When doctors wrote about sex, they didn't just describe organs, they described morality, temperament, and even planetary influence. Mercury, for instance, governed lustful intellect. Mars ruled passion. If your birth chart was wrong, you might be more prone to sinful urges. Sorry, Pisces. Religious visions added their own flair. Some mystics described being tormented by demons wielding phallic serpents or cold winds of temptation. Others, like Saint Hildegard of Bingen, interpreted sexuality as part of divine balance, natural but dangerous when misused. She even described the act in glowing metaphors of rivers and light, profoundly poetic and deeply uncomfortable if read aloud at family dinners. Meanwhile, folklore filled the gaps science couldn't explain. Miscarriages were blamed on bad dreams, wandering spirits, or sleeping in the wrong direction. Impotence could result from evil eye curses or spiteful witches who tied knots in your bed sheets. And unwanted desire easily cured by rubbing crushed snails on your chest while reciting Psalm 51 backwards. Honestly, modern dating apps should come with that feature. Then there were the punishments in the afterlife. Medieval art is rich with hellscapes where lustful souls suffer ironic fates, eternally chased by flaming genitals, pecked by beak-faced demons, or forced to bathe in rivers of boiling passion. One manuscript shows a man being spanked by a devil with a fish. The symbolism is unclear, the discomfort universal. And yet within all this fear and shame, there was also a strange kind of wonder. People still wrote love poems, painted naked saints with blushing cheeks, whispered stories of star-crossed lovers turned into birds or flowers. Even in the darkest times, the spark of curiosity, the need to understand ourselves and our desire never quite went out. So tonight, as your breath slows and the glow from your bedside lamp fades, let's honor the awkward, beautiful truth that people in the Middle Ages were just like us. Confused, curious, sometimes wildly wrong, but always deep down trying to make sense of love, of longing, and of the complicated dance between body and soul. And if nothing else, be thankful. You didn't have to drink powdered beetles to improve your warmth of affection or explain your birth chart to a goat-herding inquisitor or confess to a friar that you dreamt about your neighbor's elbows. You survived. You listened and you made it all the way through. The air is still now. No more clanging bells, no rustle of parchment, no judgmental friars peering through confession screens, just the soft thrum of your breath and the quiet tap of time flowing forward. You've wandered far tonight through candle-lit brothel, whispered spells, awkward marriage beds, and the strange corridors of medieval minds. You've peered behind convent doors, tiptoed through moral courts, and laughed gently at the missteps of 1,000 yesterdays. And in doing so, you've seen something essential that even the weirdest, most bewildering beliefs come from a place of longing to love, to be loved, to feel some agency over the chaos of life. It's a little comforting, isn't it, that even with saints, stars, and sinners looming overhead, people still tried. They tried to make sense of their hearts, tried to navigate the tangled rules, tried above all to find connection, to find meaning in a kiss, a glance, a vow, murmured in the dark. So let all that weight lift now. Let it float off with the smoke from the last candle in the last brothel in the last medieval village tucked in your mind. You're not there anymore. You're here, safe, warm, held in the hush of now. Your pillow cradles you like the softest chapel stone. The quiet hum of sleep beckons like a far-off choir. And nothing, no bishop, no spell book, no fish-wielding demon is coming to ask what's on your mind. Close your eyes. Drift deeper. You've made it through the strangest night in